Welcome to the Hub's 2025 election night coverage. I'm Rudyard Griffiths, co-founder and publisher. I'm joined in studio by my fellow co-founder and editor-at-large, Sean Spear. Sean, I'm so glad that we're doing this together.
Yeah, it's been a long campaign, and it's just wonderful to culminate it tonight with our live election show, the first big live show we've done marking an election, and to have our team here and our audience here. Yeah. And some great guests. It's going to be an interesting night.
Yeah, so just to break it down for viewers, please, again, share this link with friends and family. Let's get all kinds of smart fellow folk who are interested in intelligent conversation on this election, the big policy issues, the consequences. We're going to unpack it all for you over the coming hours. We've got a great set of guests. Timed to the different poll closings. So in a few moments, after Sean and I kick it around a little bit with you on the chat, we're going to go to Atlantic Canada and get some feedback there before polls close. And we start having results coming in. And then, hey, we're off across the country. Some former premiers popping into the program. It's going to be a good night, Sean.
Yeah, isn't it? And we have a race, don't we? I mean, if you would have told me 2 weeks ago that the range of possibilities was as wide open as it is now, I wouldn't have believed you. The Liberals seem to be approaching double-digit lead nationally. You know, there's a sense that there was a red wave happening, and for a whole host of reasons, that red wave seems to have slowed down, and it'll be fascinating to see what Canadians ultimately decide.
We're going to be dipping in and out of the chat all evening, so get your questions going for Ellie Gross. And look, it's time to make fun of our hedgy vests here. You know, you and me, Sean, we're dressed like I don't know what. Have some fun with us, audience. We're looking forward to it. So let's go to Elliot Gross for a couple questions. We'll get him out of the chat right now. What are the issues top of mind for you as we wait for the first results to start coming in from Atlantic Canada? Elliot, over to you. Anything you're seeing on the chat right now you want to bring into the conversation?
Well, we had a question from earlier this morning that we didn't get to. Someone was asking, is there an alternative world where Pierre Poilievre went less hard on Trudeau and Jagmeet, Trudeau stays on, NDPers stay in double digits, and the Conservatives get a massive majority, i.e. Pierre Poilievre was too good of an opposition leader?
Yeah. I have a funny story along those lines. A friend of mine in the Conservative caucus told me that one of his biggest regrets was last year Poilievre and others came into the caucus, Roger, and did a presentation on a comprehensive campaign to litigate the case against Prime Minister Trudeau and his government. They put a big spend behind it. They flooded the zone on conventional television, online, through other means. And this friend of mine says he regrets not asking, what happens if it works? One can't help but think that between that campaign, the big win in Toronto, St. Paul's, of course, progress in a series of other by-elections, the party essentially put Prime Minister Trudeau in an unsustainable position that ultimately, of course, culminates with his resignation and Mark Carney's ascendancy. And yeah, it'll be among the what-ifs of this election campaign.
Yeah. Just want to remind viewers that in addition to popping into the chat, we will be popping into the news feeds of the big network. So we really hope that over the course of this evening, you can choose us as your first screen. We'd love that. Have us as our second screen. Dump in and out of our feed. We're happy to have you here as long as you'd like to be. And again, get on that email. Send out this link to friends and family. If you're looking for a smart place to hang out on election night, well, we've got some fantastic guests. We got Sean Spear in the house, Theo Argydas, our editor-at-large for economics and business, will be dropping in studio here into our third chair. Harrison Lohman, our managing editor also, who's been following the media closely through this election, will also be here. And again, tons of great guests every 15 to 30 minutes. So let's go back to Elliot before we get our first guest out of Atlantic Canada for a little more of the action that's going on in the live chat.
All right, Pro Nintendo Gamer is in our chat asking, do you think the Bloc would ever form a government with the Conservatives?
Well, it's an interesting question, and it gets to a bigger point, doesn't it, Roger? If we do have a minority, whether it's one led by the Conservatives or one led by the Liberals, they're going to need a dance partner, a party or a parliamentary partner to sustain them. And over the past 4 years, of course, the Liberals and the New Democrats have operated as functionally a coalition government. If Mark Carney wins a minority, a big question will be, is there a sufficient number of NDP parliamentarians to essentially function as a majority government as we've had over the past 4 years? If not, then a Carney-led government is going to have to work out some type of arrangement, ostensibly with the Bloc Québécois. The same, of course, goes for the Conservatives.
Yeah.
So I think one of the interesting things to think about coming out of this election campaign, particularly in a world of a minority parliament, is just how functional is the parliament?
Yeah.
How long can
How
a
long
new
will it
government
last?
last?
Yeah.
And does it position a new government well to deal with the myriad of challenges it's going to face, including, of course, entering into negotiations with the Trump administration?
Yeah, all the polling that we've had has clearly indicated a great desire on the part of voters to see a majority tonight. So we'll have to see whether that all lines up, whether that sentiment helps people, move out of one column into another. It'll be fascinating to break that all down. Just on the minority parliament scenario, though, Sean, if it is a Carney minority, which is, a not unlikely scenario at the end of tonight, what is the potential for Mark Carney to work with the NDP in the same way that Justin Trudeau really forged during his minority parliament a powerful coalition, in a sense, with the NDP through the supply agreement? Do you think that type of relationship, that type of cross-party partnership is possible under Carney, or do you think he might chafe at some of the demands that Jagmeet Singh, if Jagmeet Singh is still around after this election, if he wins his seat tonight?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because, of course, the Carney coalition is so broad. So in one sense, that type of arrangement could work, particularly since he's pulled away so much NDP support. But keep in mind, he also has a range of accessible voters far to the right of the New Democrats that would be conservative liberal switchers. And so it will put, if that's the outcome, will put Carney in a tough box. Who does he ultimately, the problem with centrism is you're going to make someone mad, right? Yeah. And so, I think it's fascinating to think about a scenario in which Carney doesn't have a majority. Maybe the NDP isn't enough seats to sustain them, but if they don't, just how can this parliament properly function? I think that is a question that's going to loom over not just tonight's conversation, but possibly the coming days and weeks.
Yeah. Let's see if we can squeeze in one more question at least before we go to our first guest, giving us a sense of the campaign on the ground as it unfolded in Atlantic Canada. And I just want to remind you, if you are watching this live stream now, jump into your chat, jump into your email, send out this URL. Let's get more people tuned into some independent media, not subsidized by government, who's going to be covering tonight for you. We're going to dip in and out of those big media subsidy corporations to check out their feeds because, hey, we don't have the, what is it, the $1.3 billion that the CBC does? But no worries. We'll give them a little time on our airwaves. So please hang out with us. We'd really appreciate it. Text and email the link, the URL that you're watching this live stream on right now. Elia, back to you for some feedback, some feeling. What are you seeing on the chat there? I know it can get a little bit snippy sometimes with the audience whacking away at each other. What's the vibe?
We're doing okay so far. We have some people buzzing about whether Pierre Poilievre or Jagmeet Singh are going to resign if they do poorly tonight.
Great question. I mean, Jagmeet, I think, is really he's done.
Yes.
It's hard even to see if he wins his seat.
Yes. Given,
if the single digits that we've seen in the polls translate into the potential loss of party status for the NDP. Could you imagine that? What do you think about Pierre Poilievre? What were these stories? I think we're all a little bit suspicious of where they came from, i.e. the Ontario Conservatives leaking their own poll numbers to Fife at the Globe and Mail. That would be difficult, would it not, for Pierre Poilievre?
Yeah, let me just say a few things in response to what's a really thoughtful question. I mean, just to start with the New Democrats, if you're a New Democrat tonight, Roger, anticipating the major losses that we are, you have to think about the trade-offs that you've made over the past 4 years. Can you tell yourself a story that these losses were ultimately worth it because you used your coalition partner status in order to secure NDP priorities on pharmacare and childcare and all the rest? I mean, it really comes down to a fundamental question of what's the purpose of the NDP? Is it purpose to influence policy in Canada in a progressive direction? In which case, I think Jagmeet Singh can tell himself a good story about his tenure as leader. But if its goal is to win as many seats as possible in Parliament, then it's self-evidently a failure. Yeah. And his seat, losing his seat in a way will be a symbol of that. As for the Conservatives, I mean, it's hard to speculate at this point without knowing the outcome of the race. But I think it's fair to say if Pierre Poilievre can hold the Liberals to a minority, particularly in a world where the Conservatives perform well on the popular vote, possibly even exceeding the party's support back in 2011 when it won a majority, I think you'll have a pretty strong case back to Conservative members of Parliament and the Conservative membership more broadly that he should be given another chance. The third point I make, though, is it's interesting that we weren't asked about Mark Carney. If the Liberals don't win this election, if Pierre Poilievre squeaks out a minority or even a majority, one has to imagine that Mark Carney was around for a good time, not a long time. Even the fact that he chose not to divest himself of his assets, instead putting them in a trust, which created a whole host of political problems for him, is a sign that he's here to be prime minister or bust. And so I think in that sense, all of the three major leaders have outstanding questions about their future that will be rooted ultimately in tonight's returns.
Yeah. Elliot, just back to you at the action desk. I want to make sure our first guest is there and ready to land. If you can give me a thumbs up. Okay, we are ready to go. Let's dive into Atlantic Canada, where polls are closing. Results will come in. We'll get those for you as we dip in and out of the main network feeds. But right now, Dave Tarrant is here. He's Vice President, National Strategic Communications and Atlantic Canada Lead for Enterprise Canada. Dave, thanks for being our first guest on the Hub's 2025 election night coverage.
I'll try to set a good example for everyone else. Richard, thank you for having me on. And Sean, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
David. David, before we get to the returns, I have to ask you a question I've been dying to ask you for a while. You are one of the best political organizers in the country. You played a big role in Tim Houston's election win, for the first one and his re-election, as I understand it. What do you make of the video that he released this week? Should we be interpreting as a sign that he has aspirations to enter national politics, as some have chosen to interpret it, or is that going a step too far?
It's funny, Sean, you asked the question. I was in Toronto for a work thing last week, and people have no connection to Nova Scotia are coming up to me, and they're showing me the video. And it's an incredible video of Tim Houston kind of showing this immense amount of pride in being a Nova Scotian and really taking on a world what it means to be from Nova Scotia. And saying, oh, what does this mean? What does this mean? Well, I think what it means is you have a political leader in Nova Scotia who's immensely proud of where he's from, and in a time of immense anxiety for the people he represents, is sending a message that he's got their back and he's one of them. People want to read into narratives, let them. I think one of the things that's beyond the video that is certainly nice for Nova Scotians is that Tim Houston has become a legitimately serious national leader, which for a smaller province is not always the case. He has been the leader across the country when it comes to breaking down internal trade barriers. You see the way Premier Ford in Ontario talks about him and others. And so he's a consequential national figure from the Premier's office in Nova Scotia. And I know it's a source of pride to him. People will speculate, but at the same time, like I said, if you really want to kind of spread your wings as a national leadership ambition, you'll be doing more than just talking about your own province. And so I think he's going to be a nationally relevant leader for a long time. But I think some of the speculation is a bit premature.
What are you going to be looking for as the results start to come in for Atlantic Canada to understand how the region is going to go?
Well, I know there's been a series of shifts in public opinion in Atlantic Canada. I mean, it's worth the baseline for people who are from other parts of the country who are looking in. In the 2015 election, Trudeau won all 32 seats in Atlantic Canada, a clean sweep. There was no Conservatives, there were no NDP in Atlantic Canada. And then you look through kind of the 2019 and 2021 elections, Conservatives are chip away, get some of their kind of old bastions back. But while there are always pockets of conservative strength in Atlantic Canada, the trends generally push more liberal than the alternative. And then something really interesting happened in the spring of 2023. and that's the carbon tax rolled in and basically all at once was imposed on all of Atlantic Canada. And I tell you, you look at the collapse in the Liberal national numbers that took place in 2023. One of the sparks was Atlantic Canada, which saw over the course of about 2 months like a 20-point drop in Liberal fortune. So even though the region is small in terms of gross numbers, in terms of the Canadian population, there was a massive plummeting. And for a period of time, the greater share of Atlantic, it's about 70% of Atlantic Canadians were opposed to the carbon tax, which is more than almost any other region of the country. And so that did metastasize into a deep loathing of Trudeau. But I think the key thing about it, more so than any other, and you can talk about other regions and how Trudeau exiting the election, how that changed the race. It's certainly true here. Because I think when you go back to 4 or 5 months ago, so much of the anger people in this region had towards the Liberal government was personal anger to Justin Trudeau. Yeah. And the moment he left the scene, then that pain point disappeared. And more so than any other region, I think that people here are willing to give the Liberal Party a fresh look. And I think that's the kind of headwind that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives had to deal with.
With that reset in mind, David, what are reasonable expectations for the Conservative Party out of Atlantic Canada? What would a baseline look like, and what in your mind would a failure look like in terms of trying to make up some of the ground the party has lost over the past several weeks?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I think if the Conservatives win double-digit seats, they should be ecstatic. Out of the 32, I think there's about 5 or 6 that I think they should feel pretty good about in any event. This is not going to be a 2015 wipeout. The distribution of votes is different, but I think getting into the double digits would be a success. We'll see if they get there. I'm looking at there are ridings. I'm thinking about like Cape Breton, Kanso-Antigonish in Nova Scotia, where the former finance minister of Nova Scotia, Alan McMaster, is running. That would have been in the bag in December. Got to take a look now. You look at Central Nova, where that's Sean Fraser's riding, where a conservative candidate, Bryson Jenkins, running a strong campaign.
Polly was there in recent days, right?
Yeah. Right. You have a situation in Nova Scotia, you have South Shore St. Margaret Perkins, where the NDP candidate dropped out on the deadline for nominations, basically meaning that he's going to face every anti-conservative voter will automatically breach. You look at the seats in New Brunswick, like St. John's, Kennebanaxis, right? That's the Wayne Long riding. That would be one that they would have wanted to knock off a long time. We'll see if Wayne Long can hang on. There was the Miramichi riding used to be Jake Stewart's riding. We'll see if the Conservatives can hang on there. And then you look at, I think the Liberals win all 4 PEI seats. And then you look at the Newfoundland and Labrador, where there's a real rural-urban split. Do the Conservatives kind of challenge in the old Goody Hutchins riding in the Long Range Mountains? We'll see. That's going to be an interesting right. And in Avalon, right, where it should be a Conservative seat. That's where there's been some back and forth about how the Conservative nomination was given to Steve Kent, who's a well-known local personality there. Yes. So, I mean, these are some of the constituencies I'm looking at. It's going to be tough. Like the numbers, like the Conservatives, there's been some tightening back. But I mean, about a week ago, the Liberals were up 20 points in Atlantic Canada. And while a lot of that's going to be them just spiking the football in places like Halifax, where we're very, very strong, it gets those headwinds. It's going to be hard. So I'm looking at kind of, less than 6, serious disappointment. I think is over 10. You do a bit of a cartwheel and see if they fall in the range in between.
Wow, I'm pleased to report that 4 of 75,944 polls have reported, Sean. We have roughly 250 votes cast as of the tracker right now, 67% share for the Conservatives, 29% for the Liberals. I don't think those trends will continue as the night goes on. Before we wrap up with you, Dave, what are the big issues in Atlantic Canada? What were the big kind of questions that the region wanted answered out of this election? And did the election provide answers to Atlantic Canadian voters on those big questions that people were mulling over?
It's an excellent question. I think the big one is so much of Atlantic Canada has, I'm here from Halifax, where there's been a rental crisis, a housing crisis. It's a real issue. You see it in the other cities too, right? You see it, you go to Moncton, you go to St. John's, like you see those issues as well. And there's affordability crisis, inflation hit hard here. It's an older population. right? So more seniors, more people worried about healthcare and so on and so forth. But the catalyzing, like I mentioned to you earlier, the catalyzing issue in this region was the carbon tax. People, it's disliked everywhere. It's amazing how far we come. It's despised in Atlantic Canada, and to the point that it flipped the partisan narrative. When Carney kind of removed the carbon tax, it took away what is a massive pain point. And I think in the absence of that, you talk about probably a recurring theme, how Canadians in general perceive leadership. Canadian, I mean, I think about conversations with members of my own family. They couldn't wait to see the back of Justin Trudeau's head going through the door. But once he was gone, they say, well, are we really sold on the Pierre Poilievre style of politics? And I think Poilievre, his skill in binding supporters to him by really channeling people's anger and frustration with the broken status quo. It's a kind of anger that's not really frequent in Atlantic Canadian politics, right? There's anger at a broken status quo. There's anger at institutions. You look at the Prairie people, there's anger at institutions that have let them down or they feel betrayed by. That current of thought is not as deference to institutions is a bigger thing out here. Anger at institutions that drives so much Western Canadian alienation is not really a thing here. Atlantic Canadians were angry, but they were angry at Justin Trudeau. And so you remove that, there's always a chance that Carney, drops the ball seriously, and people get angry at him too, but you can't count on that. And so I think what you need to calibrate is, well, how do you channel that energy without the boogeyman of Trudeau driving people who aren't natural conservatives into your coalition?
David, as we wrap up, if I can ask you a question that draws on your broader experience and expertise. I mentioned in the instrumental role you played in Tim Houston's elections. We worked together in Ottawa for Prime Minister Harper. You also spent time working for Ontario Premier Doug Ford, someone who's loomed larger than premiers typically do in this federal election campaign, and in particular, the tensions between the Federal Conservative Party and the Ontario Progressive Party have spilled out over the course of this campaign. Do you want to just reflect on those tensions, what you make of them, and what their implications are for our national politics?
Yeah, Sean, it's a great question, and I think, like you, I have friends who I think are on different sides of some heated personal matters and political strategic differences right now. So I think we all need to be a little bit diplomatic in how some of this works. I'd say this, there's a lot of back and forth about the strategy Pierre Poilievre and his team put in place.
Yes.
I'm of the camp that had they leaned wholeheartedly into Trump at the expense of a change narrative, they'd be worse off right now than they are right now. Other people can disagree. And the game for Poilievre was not to out liberal the liberals on Trump. I don't think that, you say the issue was trying to remind people about all the things that they didn't like about the liberals and the status quo and make that a competing narrative. Did they do that as well as they could have? Was it a game that wasn't meant to be at any stage of the game? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you lean into an issue where your opponents lead by 20 points. We'll get you where you need to go. What I will say is, I think it's an important lesson for people from all sides in the conservative campaign and provincial parties. So whether you're winning or losing, sometimes it's better to break bread with someone who you agree with on 70% of the issues and disagree strongly with on 30% of the issues than kind of go all or nothing.
That's the
and I think there's too much all. Yes. Yeah. I think there's too much all or nothingism, particularly in conservative politics. And you look at the left, you look at the NDP levels, the degree to which NDP voters are willing to toss. God bless them. We all own our vote, left, right, in between. I don't judge anywhere how they use their vote. But if you're a socialist and you're prepared to toss out everything you fought for and vote for a former Goldman Sachs banker to block the conservatives, whereas conservatives will tear each other's throats out for marginal differences on an issue, even though they agree on 70% of items. I think there needs to be an important understanding that sometimes you want to win an election, you got to put a little bit of water into your wine. And that's true for a red Tory, and that's true for a populist cultural conservative from the prairies. And I think maybe I hope the conservatives win tonight. I hope they win big tonight. I hope they don't win, they hold Carney to a minority. I think whether you're a red Tory or a hardcore conservative, or a cultural conservative, the understanding that if things go well, this was a near-death experience, or it was a true death experience. That we gotta think better about how we actually treat people who we might disagree with from time to time.
Well, Dave Tarrant with Enterprise Canada, wise words, great insight. Fantastic to have you kick off our 2025 election coverage with an on-the-ground assessment of Atlantic Canada. We'll continue to track for our viewers seat counts and projections as they come in over the coming hours. So, Dave, thanks for including us in your election night.
Thanks for having me on. I'll be watching the stream for the rest of the night. So good luck, guys.
Good man. Well, just reminding you, if you are watching the stream, please get out that link, tweet it out to your friends, send it off via WhatsApp to your groups, get on your email. Let's get more people on this feed, having a civil, substantive, and hopefully informing and elevating conversation about election 2025 and the results today. Well, Sean, we got to go back to the chat because it's lively. Elia is telling me all kinds of action there going on. So, Elia, what's the mood? What are the issues that are popping up in the chat as we kick off election 2025 coverage here on the Hub?
Well, we have a lot of chatter about your guys' vest. People asking if that's a mandatory part of being a founder of the Hub. But we had someone earlier in the chat asking for your guesses on if the cabinet will change a lot post-election.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that great question. Do you want to deal with the vests first, or should I? We like to have fun with some stuff. We're going to have fun with you tonight. So I think by the time we get to 10:30, 11 o'clock, there may be something a little more than just water in this glass here, Sean. I hope you join me in that. I saw you bought some Glenfiddich or something that's out there on the counter, and we'll be enjoying that come hell or high water, whatever the results. But let's talk about this question related to Carney, because it is interesting that he did that mini shuffle going in, and a lot of traditional Liberal cabinet ministers, Chrystia Freeland, featured in that, despite getting only 8% of the vote in the Liberal leadership. So cabinet making, as you know, you've been in a government before. It's an art, not a science. There has to be a lot of regional variation. Does he replicate Trudeau on gender? Does he, make an acknowledgement to that part of the Liberal Party? What does he do with a Liberal Party that, if they win tonight, will win by pulling half of the NDP's vote, traditional vote, away from them? How do you acknowledge all those NDP voters who are now, in a sense, part of a very powerful party coalition? How do they factor into a cabinet? Yeah,
what's the old line, Roger, that cabinet making involves working with the timber that you have? You're right that immediately after winning the Liberal leadership, Mark Carney constituted a cabinet that, for all intents and purposes, was a version of a Trudeau cabinet. Should he win this election, that's going to change, at least for one reason, and that is a considerable number of Trudeau-era ministers haven't stood for election in this race. Our listeners and viewers may recall that over the past year or so, with the party behind by as many as 20-25 points, a lot of people voted with their feet and announced that they were standing down and not running for re-election. As the party started to recover in the polls, we saw some number of ministers reverse themselves. Sean Fraser in Halifax. Characterizing himself and presenting himself is different from Prime Minister Trudeau, a centrist, as I think him and his team have sought to convey. On the other hand, there is this growing and powerful progressive element to the Liberal coalition. That was evidenced in a way when Prime Minister Trudeau stepped down in January. You recall, as he addressed the Canadian public, he didn't speak to Liberals. He spoke to progressives. This is now a key part of the Liberal Party, and one that Prime Minister Carney is going to have to account for in constituting a cabinet, which comes back to, I think, a broader challenge. You just think about the issues that he's going to have to address as Prime Minister, and trying to find that balance in such a broad coalition, from Bay Street capitalists to Hamas-supporting social activists. It's going to be a difficult task, to say the least.
Yeah. I wonder. Now let's put the shoe on the other foot. If Pierre Poilievre wins tonight, what does a Conservative cabinet look like? Many people have commented there were not a lot of star candidates that ran in this election. There are some people, friends of ours, albeit, like Adam Chambers, like Michael Chong, like Melissa Lantsman, that could well form, ministers in major portfolios. But looking at that caucus, having to fill the full panoply of government roles, that to me would suggest a very top-down operation with a very powerful leader in PMO, driving cabinet.
Yeah.
And maybe that's nothing new, but you tell me.
When Stephen Harper first became Prime Minister in 2006, he had candidates running for him like Jim Flaherty, John Baird, Tony Clement, people who had extensive cabinet experience at the provincial level. In this election cycle, the Conservative Party hasn't nominated, as you say, some of these well-known, high-profile star candidates. It has followed a kind of small d democratic process by and large, which is to say it's enabled riding associations to select candidates at the local level. And so, yeah, I think a big question, if Pierre Poilievre forms a cabinet, is how does he supplement, I think, a pretty strong front bench, people you mentioned, Chong, Chambers, Lantsman, Rachel Danko, and others, with some of the new energy coming out of this slate of candidates. And then, as you say, what's the effect between the relationship between the Prime Minister and the cabinet? I would just say if those are the questions that Pierre Poilievre faces tomorrow, he'll be feeling pretty good about tonight.
Well, Sean, look who just slipped in while we were wagging our gums. Hey,
this is so great. I'm with both of you at the same time. Where's my vest, though? I want a vest, too.
We have more outside, trust me. We got red vests out there, just in case. Whatever happens tonight, we can go red or blue, depending on the polls. Amanda Galbraith, co-founder, partner at Oyster Group, someone who's been a regular contributor to our election coverage. Thank you so much for spending the last 36 days with us.
I'm excited to actually, honestly, you guys are my last hit today, and after this, I'm going to go get some liquor.
Okay. Well, we have that outside too.
This is way better than the normal set. So I'm like, where am I going to spend the last few punditry moments? It's with these two gentlemen, smart people, thoughtful people. We'll have fun.
Go ahead, Sean.
So, Amanda, let's talk about cities. It's something we've talked about with you over the past several weeks. The by-election win in Toronto and St. Paul was a signal that the Conservatives were making some inroads in cities, which of course is important given the high concentration of seats here. In the face of some of the polling changes we've seen over the past several weeks, the ambitions around those gains has diminished some. But why don't you just talk about the importance for the Conservatives in making inroads in cities generally, and what, if anything, we might see tonight in that regard?
Yeah, I think it's a great point that you've raised before, which is, candidly, more people are moving to cities, right? That's where the votes are, yes. And Conservatives needed to get better at speaking to those demographics.
May I just say a minute? Just data out in the past couple of days that Toronto is the fastest growing city in North America for the second year in a row.
Wow.
Yeah, right? That's it. So to win, to be successful, we have to learn how to speak to cities, people who live there. And there's been this rule, downtown urbanites, they can't vote Conservative. It's not a conservative place. We don't have policies for them. I completely disagree. I think the campaign, talking about crime, talking about issues of drug use, talking even about housing, those are all gateways into cities. I think the Conservative campaign, for everyone throwing pot shots from the sidelines at it, raised their voting floor. We've accessed a whole new kind of voter, the under 40, many of whom are in urban centers. And I think that is significant to me, what we've done. So for us to be a successful party and movement in the long run, we need to figure out how to speak to urbanites, and I think in a way that's authentically conservative, not in a way that's simply copying progressive or liberal values because we want to win seats.
Let's talk a little bit about the campaign that was. What do you feel in terms of both parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives, maybe missed opportunities things that were passed over that they might have considered? You've spent a lot of time on campaigns. You've been through this. I know it's all 2020 hindsight now, but just, inform us a little bit. What did you see in both these major campaigns, the Liberals and the Conservatives, that might, if it had been done differently or something new had been added to the campaign, could have led to a different result than the one we'll see tonight?
I mean, hard to say any of this stuff would lead to. I feel like the Donald Trump X Factor really actually did animate a lot of this campaign in a way that it's hard for a normal campaign to pivot to. I would say from the Conservative side, one thing I think we saw in the latter 2 weeks was, more of these one-on-ones with Pierre and his partner, right? Like giving some air to him. I think he's actually a very competent debater. He's he can do interviews with the best of us. He's got great ideas. He's very thoughtful and principled on how he approaches and you want to see more in the softer side of him, which I think Canadians kind of needed to see, especially as part of this writ. So for me, I wish he would have a little bit more of let Pierre be Pierre, not to borrow the famous West Wing line, but out there, I don't care if he's doing an apple chewing video or if he's doing a fireside chat with his wife. I just think any of those things were helpful.
Yeah, he seemed a bit at times overly in control. The suit, the hair, again, unfortunately, a lot of this is image. It's not, we like to think it's substance at the hub, but a lot of this is, what people project. And I felt at times he looked very buttoned down, almost kind of too in control. And I'm surprised they didn't kind of loosen him up a bit, even just stylistically, how he dressed, the format of these very formal podiums with the microphones. And maybe that was to try to push back against Carney's cosplaying at Prime Minister every 4 or 5 days, rushing back to Ottawa to meet with premiers. That was quite something. But do you feel, what would your advice have been to kind of loosen up a bit?
I mean, I'm a much more, I believe in engaging with media at kind of all levels. I just think there's some utility to that and in different ways. So I think their use of social, for example, was very, there was a video they just put out yesterday, the day before, where it's a 3-generational family and he makes pasta with them in the basement. Yeah. And I actually thought that was very powerful. He comes in and kind of wrestles with the guy a little bit and he seems loose. And I'm like, I like this guy. I'd have a beer with this guy. This guy could be my PM. And I think showing that, rounding out that part of him beyond just the big rallies, which early on I'm still a big fan of. And it's so funny, we're so inured to it almost because, they can just pack 6,000 people in an airport hangar and that's fine. That's just what the Conservatives do. That's not a normal campaign thing. That is a huge, massive undertaking. It speaks to the professionalism of that campaign. So I think for me, it would have been a little more let's loosen it up, maybe shift the every other day rally to some other kind of pieces. I would have done that if that was me, but I'm not the big people smart. And then for the Carney campaign, what they could have done better is probably send him away further and have him do more PM things, honestly. But we'll see the results tonight. But they very much, I think, they didn't run a spectacular campaign to my mind at all. Yeah. I think they ran we talked about this, Protect the King front runner campaign, very safe. And I imagine if they could have stuck him in Nunavut on an ice floe for the entirety of the campaign, they would have done so.
If I can just before I put a question to you, just to say in parentheses, I agree with that analysis. That in a way, Polly was at his best when he was a bit vulnerable. Mm-hmm. I've known him for a long time. I've spent hours with him. I'm afraid that I didn't know that his daughter was nonverbal, something we learned in an intimate one-on-one podcast interview. There's a moment that resonated a great deal for me as a parent, I think probably with a lot of others. And in hindsight, it's just a reminder of Conservatives generally that they shouldn't be apprehensive to let people in a bit because I think that exposes the extent to which what they bring to political office is experiences and insights that a lot of people share. I asked you a question, Amanda, about Toronto and cities. Let me ask you a question about Windsor, where you're from. Yeah. A big part of the Conservative campaign isn't just pushing the numbers up, as you mentioned. In a way, we're seeing a change in the composition of Conservative support as well, making major gains with a group of voters that we've come to characterize as realignment voters, working class, blue-collar Conservatives, which is making them competitive in places like Windsor, places like Thunder Bay, places like Sudbury. Just talk a bit about that realignment dynamic and what you think it means in this election and possibly future ones in terms of this changing dynamic within Conservative politics itself.
Yeah, I think it's been an interesting movement we've seen. And even candidly, if you look at Aaron O'Toole, even began sort of that process for the modern Canadian Conservative movement.
Yes.
I think we saw it very successfully executed by Monty McNaughton and Doug Ford in Ontario. And Monty, I know, has been supportive of the national campaign. And we've seen those smaller endorsements, but like still union endorsements. And I can say growing up in a place like Windsor, the union people were not conservative voters, not by a long stretch.
Yes.
And now if I go home, it's very easy to expect that those union workers, those blue collar workers, which I think even as a kind of a term feels a little outdated to me, to be honest, because laborers, tradespeople are candidly making very good money, or very sophisticated voters, and I think they're kind of underappreciated as a demographic. So it's smart of the Conservative Party to expand that base and to say, hey, we respect the work that you do. We get the work that you do. We're not just out here giving sound bites about getting the big wigs and CEOs and stuff like that. We understand the complexity of the work and the job that you are. And I think, again, to underestimate how we've grown the base amongst young people, amongst union voters, would be silly in this campaign not to recognize that for sure.
Let's talk about my favorite topic, the media. You just did a whole bunch of hits today. How did you think the media did in this campaign? Were they, I don't know, good, bad, ugly? What's your verdict on the campaign as seen by voters through the eyes of the mainstream press?
I remain frustrated by the mainstream press's focus unilaterally on Trump. And I say that not as a conservative, but I say that as just a Canadian who thinks, maybe it's because I'm kind of the cusp of that demographic around affordability and those issues. I think it does a disservice to the country that we don't actually spend enough time digging into those other areas. And it wasn't like there was a lack of policy in this election campaign, by the way. All the parties had platforms. They had pretty meaty trade policies and other issues, housing policies. I mean, if you look at the conservative and liberal housing policy alone, those two approaches are very opposite of one another, and I think very interesting to talk about. So I think the media did the easy story sometimes and the big story out front, as opposed to, I think, what would have served Canadians better. I also think we're in the midst of a bit of a change or a sea change around what is the media in this country. And we see those tensions boiled over at the debate night, where the media was the story and not the debate, which was the weird thing to me and not really appropriate. So I think the tensions between the campaigns certainly spilled over into coverage when you're doing stories about how you're not getting many questions. And I think, there's a certain level of fair enough, but at the end of the day, do average Canadians want to read that on the national news, read that every night? Probably not. I think there's more things to
Just a follow-up question, Sean. What did you think of the difference between the two campaigns and their use of the media? So the Carney campaign ran a very traditional kind of mainstream media. Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives did something different. They went to bloggers, to vloggers, to a live streamers, to a whole other set of people that are below probably the radar of 90% of our audience tuning in right now, but seem very connected to the audience that was showing up at his rallies. I wonder, we'll see tonight, won't we, in terms of the voter turnout and whether these traditionally lower information, lower participation voters turn out. Did you think that strategy was risky? Do you think it was just upside? There was only upside in doing that? I don't know. How do you think of it?
Going into the campaign, I was very much of the belief that having media not on the plane, like, who cares? It's a process story. It doesn't matter. Mainstream media are increasing, and I say this as a member of the mainstream media, are increasingly less influential day by day, right? As we see more folks like yourselves and whatever entering that space. I think, again, because of the Trump effect and how Canadians were unusually turned into the news, they were looking at watching news in ways they normally don't because of the Trump stuff, because they're scared, that unfortunately, like, that pendulum swung back a bit. And I think the mainstream press had more influence, especially over the plus 60 bracket, which is like a real dedicated voter base that conservatives maybe we take for granted and maybe we shouldn't have to date. So I think as a strategy going forward, and it's still smart to go beyond the mainstream press because they're not going to get a fair shake in the mainstream press most of the time, but courting those bloggers, those alternative outlets, to me, all of that is smart tactics. But I do think to a certain extent you have to play ball with the mainstream guys, because especially when they're as influential as they were in this campaign, they were more influential than normal. It will hurt you in points, and I think it's hurting them with the over 60s.
I asked you about being an urbanite. I asked you about being from Windsor. Let me ask you a question about being a professional woman and a mom.
Sure.
Conservatives, if polls bear out, will have underperformed with women. Issues around fertility played a role in this campaign. Poilievre talked about women's biological clocks, and it precipitated this reaction from the Liberals and others in the media and online. Talk a bit about the Conservative Party's challenges with women, and what, if anything, you think the party needs to take away from this in the election, in this campaign, and what adjustments to messages or messenger or policies to try to make gains with women voters in Canada.
Yeah, and I will say I was not one of the women that got all worked up about the biological clock line, because
you
it's
were
a
excellent,
reality.
and in fact, you wrote a must-read column about the subject.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I actually think I was happy that he brought it up, and I can say, talking to females, friends my age, other women, they all have that same pressure, right? We really do, and I think it's an increasingly major issue that we are ignoring as a public policy. So for Pierre and Anna to talk about it, I thought that was good and smart and an important conversation we should be having as a country. Interestingly, the Liberals have IVF for all Canadians in their platform. Yes. Maybe that's a counterbalance to the Conservative conversation. I'm not sure, but I think the more we can do that. I do think, as we can recognize, Conservatives lag with women. It is something that I find frustrating, and I think part of it is we tend to promote, we have the male pale and stale are always up there in the front, right? Well, bless the male pale and stale. They're all my friends too. But
are they wearing blue vests?
I don't know. Well, maybe I need
a male pale and stale attired in this luxury from Amazon Basics.
That's when he was talking about Poilievre's wardrobe. What he was really trying to say was he should have worn a vest.
Hedgy vest. The
hedgy
vest would have closed it. Just closed the whole
vest.
campaign.
But I think we have to recognize as a party that the way we've been speaking to women is not working. Yes. It's not. And it works for people like me, but I'm not probably your average female voter.
Indeed.
So how do we soften those edges? How do we appeal to women? How do we front window female politicians, colleagues?
What if you elected a woman leader for a change?
It'd be amazing, right? We
solve a lot of problems.
We've broken a lot of barriers, like the Conservative Party, provincially in Ontario, first female speaker. You could argue the first female prime minister, kind of technically, was a woman. I'd like to see an elected one do that. But I think there's a lot of space for Conservatives to break those boundaries. So I think we need to have a conversation as a party about how we talk to women and how we appeal to female voters. And if that's talking about IVF, if that's talking about biological clocks in a different way, fine, but we should have those conversations.
Here. Well said.
Amanda, stay there. We're going to get some questions from our live stream and have them put to you. So Elia, over to you. What are you seeing in the live stream? Let's get some questions from our viewing audience, just to say, if you are enjoying this kind of, not always serious, a bit silly conversation, but nonetheless one rich in insight and experience, please share the link for this this YouTube broadcast right now on your chats, in your social feeds, and via email to friends and family. Let's get more people on the feed as we head towards the closing of polls in Ontario and Quebec into the West at 9:30. So Elia, over to you and the chat.
All right, Jeff is in the chat asking, should the Conservatives have proposed a tougher immigration policy, not just on overall numbers, but specifically on the source countries, to create a more clear wedge issue?
What do you think, Amanda? How do you think immigration was played in this election? It was interesting that both party platforms did acknowledge, in a sense, the Conservative platform was more explicit about linking immigration to housing starts and just basically the absorptive capacity of Canadian society and the economy. Liberals similarly coming out saying, in a sense, that we're stopping basically the unbridled migration of the Trudeau years. Do you think that the issue was addressed in the campaign to the extent that voters wanted to see it addressed?
Probably not. I think it actually is an issue. I think it's an issue cresting, candidly, in this country. Yes. I think the impact of it is still being absorbed by Canadians. My guess is on the Conservative side, they would probably be afraid of being too far ahead of that and being demonized to a certain extent in the campaign. You could view it as an 80-20 issue, which is like everybody nods their heads, but 20% of the population just screams. their hair on fire. So I think, could we have had a bigger debate? And we should have maybe had a bigger debate around this issue for sure, because it impacts affordability, our ability to access healthcare, education. Yeah. I mean, even like
infrastructure,
daycare for us. Like I can't find a daycare spot
to say nothing of the kind of protests and violence that we've seen in major cities over the past year and a half.
Yeah, exactly. So I do think they could have maybe expanded on that. But again, that goes back to my problem with the unilateral focus on Donald Trump as an issue, which crowded out, I think, a more in-depth conversation we could have had on a host of other places, including that.
Yeah. Such a good point. Let's go back to the chat. Elliot, what do you got for us in terms of either the back and forth, what you're reading, or a specific question?
We have a specific question that was just submitted to livestream@thehub.ca. So if you don't feel comfortable popping your question in the chat, feel free to send me an email. Andrew is asking, if the Conservatives win a minority tonight, then do the Liberals as incumbents have the first crack at forming government by advising the GG that they can form a coalition?
Oh, no. This is Sean's bugbear.
Somebody
everybody.
Get me a drink.
It's only 7:50, guys, and we've hit the mother load for Sean Spear. So here, let's wind him up. Wind him up. Here he goes.
This question has been...
Okay, rephrase the question
So
first.
they said the question is such an essential one, which is to say, in the event that the Conservatives win a plurality of votes, plurality of seats rather, but not a majority, is it an expectation that Prime Minister Carney would resign and give Pierre Poilievre the chance to form a government, establish a cabinet, deliver a speech from the throne, and see if he can indeed secure the confidence of the House? That is how our politics has played out for virtually all of Canadian history. That is, winner gets first crack at forming government. There are those who argue that has how it's played out practically. In theory, the incumbent prime minister can remain in office if he or she can demonstrate that his government or her government can secure the confidence of the House. In effect, undoing the election result of Canadians across the country. It's an interesting constitutional conversation. You know, it might be something we talk about in a seminar room, but I just think I think the evidence overwhelmingly points in the direction that winner gets first crack at it. I think Canadians' common sense sensibilities tell them that the winner ought to get first crack at it. But make no mistake, if Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives win a minority government, but with a plurality of seats but not a majority, we will wake up in the coming days to arguments in the opinion section of the Globe and Mail and other places arguing that there's not an onus on Mark Carney to resign. In fact, he would be fulfilling the norms of the Westminster system if he tried to hold on. And I think if he did, it would be a political crisis, the likes of which we've not seen in our country since at least the trucker convoy of 2021, 2022, and possibly beyond that. So interesting theoretical conversation, but as a matter of practical politics, I think the evidence is overwhelming. And the risks of even, in my mind, entertaining such an idea could be explosive, particularly for those Western Canadians who, for several election cycles, have participated in our politics, done what we've asked them, gone to the ballot box, voted for conservative governments. They've lost those elections and they've accepted the outcome. They've not questioned the system. They've not doubted the outcome. They've accepted that notwithstanding their own preferences, the rest of the country disagrees with them, and that's how things play out. If in this case the Conservatives actually win enough seats, but we have this collusion between different political actors, opinion leaders, academics, and so on to essentially undo the election outcome, I think it would be a crisis and one that could have huge implications for our politics.
So you're in crisis communications, Amanda. What would your advice be to the Carney government in that situation? I mean, the temptation there to try and meet the House, if you can, maybe the NDP, there's a few seats there, you can cobble something together. All the pressure will be on Mark Carney to do this. His own party members will be heavily invested, obviously, in the idea of continuing to hold the machinery of government. And I don't know. I like Sean, worry about this because I think the incentive structure right now, the demonization of Pierre Poilievre, the extent to which the coalition that Mark Carney now represents, that has all these NDP voters who've switched really not because of Mark Carney, but to block Pierre Poilievre. So I factor that into the equation, and I start thinking, wow, there could be a lot of people in Mark Carney's ear saying, we've created a new national governing party by merging effectively everything from the center to the reddish tinge of the NDP into our coalition. You have to go ahead and try to meet the House and deny Pierre Poilievre the opportunity. How explosive do you think it would be?
I think it would be massive. I mean, if folks remember is it 2009 when Harper was in a minority parliament, and it was the handshake with Gilles Duceppe and Stéphane Dion and Jack Layton, that famous shot. And I remember as a staff, actually I don't think I was a staffer then, I was gone, but we would rally outside the Harper 24 Sussex every morning with our little signs to say, like, because his kids would go by and they would see that, and it was sort of a momentum thing that we were doing. But I think it would be a huge crisis. I think it would be very foolish. I think also the idea is that it's possible that our politics have realigned and the NDP has disappeared from the face of the earth, but I actually think more broadly, Jagmeet Singh is just a very bad political leader, as he demonstrated in his commentary in the Toronto Star last week when he tried to write his obituary 5 days early. And that the NDP are provincially a muscular political party that knows how to govern and knows how to win. Yeah. And if any of those folks decide they want to come march up to Parliament Hill, I'm sure they could probably figure it out. So I think he would be very foolish. I think it would plunge the country into complete disarray. And he'd be better off letting a minority Conservative government try and kick at the can. And guess what? If they're unable to keep the House, then you'll have another shot. But my guess is this is probably Prime Minister Carney's, as he currently is Prime Minister, but his best political campaign he'll ever run, because nobody asked him any questions other than, what's your resume? Okay.
We're coming up to the 8 o'clock hour. Amanda, this has been so much fun. It's so much fun spending this last month with you and all your contributions to the Hub. Let's keep doing it.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Good luck tonight, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a long night. Hope you get something else in those glasses at some point.
I'm getting a little hot shot. I don't know. These things aren't really working for me now. I may have to be disrobing in a little bit. He's losing it already.
It is hot in here, though.
It is hot.
I walked in, I took my jacket off. I was like, nope.
Bloody lights, trust me. We're going to get some cold drinks coming soon. But Amanda, thank you so much for coming.
Great to have you.
Thank you guys so much.
Yeah. So our first three-way conversation at the round table here, Sean. We're making history as it goes.
If I can just say, our team has been so outstanding, Roger, since day one. This is our first full campaign at the Hub. We launched in 2021. Justin Trudeau plunged us in election weeks after we had started. And so when we had election coverage, it was nothing like the ambition we've had over the past 36 days. No way. And our team has just knocked it out of the park with a live show each day. We've had podcasts, we've had articles, we've had commentary. The performance of the website, of YouTube, of the podcast has been really outstanding. The support from our Hub heroes and Hub fellows is similarly been extraordinary. And so I'm not surprised that our team pulled off the three-way live conversation because they've been doing that all campaign.
Let's just summarize some of the results. We've, again, super early in the evening. We've got 320 of 75,000 polls reporting. Liberals elected and won. So we have our first member of Parliament elected in election 2025. They're leading in 13. The Conservatives leading in 5. So that's obviously Atlantic Canada, and it would suggest, further to our conversation off the top with Dave, that the Conservatives still have a ways to go to get to a double digit. Let's dip into a feed there. We're going to occasionally check out the odd feed. Here we are, CBC, their Canada Votes panel. Let's listen into that for a little bit, and then Sean and I will come back with some commentary. We can turn the volume up on CBC Votes.
I mean, I would say, as someone that covered Quebec politics for a decade, that you would never count the Bloc Québécois out, and the Parti Québécois continues to be strong. So yes, there's certainly a rallying around the flag effect right now. I don't know whether that's something more to read into, I guess is my point. And certainly Mr. Blanchet at the end was saying, come back to us because we're only we can defend the Quebec interests. I want to talk about the Western piece of that, but first, David Cochrane has a result.
Yeah, that's right, Rosie. We have some news. We have the first projected elected of the night, and it comes from the big land. It comes from the riding of Labrador, where the decision desk has seen enough. Philip Earle, a well-known and successful businessman in Labrador, involved with companies such as Air Labrador, succeeding Yvonne Jones as the Liberal candidate in the riding of Labrador, and succeeding Yvonne Jones as the Member of Parliament for Labrador, as Philip Earle is the first declared elected of the night, and he will be making his way to Ottawa as soon as Parliament is recalled.
I wonder if you get a door prize if you become the first elected MP in Canada of the night.
I don't know, but it's a half an hour earlier in Labrador than it is in Newfoundland, and he was able to get it done first. Yeah. So I don't know about what's going on with the counting on the island, but I'd like some more results. Okay, well,
no one's going to panic yet. It's because, as David said, when we rehearse these things, they happen in 15-minute increments, not in hours long, and that is what we're in for tonight, because it has been a competitive race.
For ourselves next time. But, hey, we don't have the 1.3 billion, so we're making do with these. Best Buy, okay? The team teases me how small my iPhone is, but it was Best Buy. It was $200. I'm very happy with it.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll dip into the other networks as we go. We just wanted to show you that the first MP of this new parliament elected. So a bit of history in the making.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, as David said, Maritimes aren't going to be a wipeout for the Conservatives. So ambition has come down greatly from where they were late last year, when there was a world in which they were going to win a majority of seats east of Quebec, but holding the Liberals a bit, I think will be viewed as a success, as David put it. And then it leads us, I think, as one of the CBC hosts were talking about, to Quebec, which I think is going to be pretty fundamental, Rudyard. If the Liberals are able to win a significant majority in the province of Quebec, it obviously positions the party well going into Ontario. I think it's fair to say that Yves Blanchet underperformed in this election campaign. It was interesting to me that Quebecers who have
underperforming despite, I think, objectively, as an English-speaking Canadian, like just as a politician, he presented wasn't bad.
Yes.
He had some pithy lines. He was kind of in the fight.
Yes.
He did an okay job in the English language debate.
Well, and I was just going to say, what's interesting about it is that Quebecers oftentimes seem a bit inoculated from the overwhelming influence of American culture and politics because of the strong sense of identity and nationhood in the province. And so for Quebecers to have flipped so significantly in the face of Trump's threats and provocations, I think it's somewhat unpredictable, or something that one wouldn't have necessarily assumed, especially, Rudyard. It must be said that Mark Carney is the weakest bilingual leader that we've had in how many election cycles? Yeah. And there was this axiom that someone who couldn't speak fluent French just would not resonate with Quebecers. So if you add those things up, first, that Quebecers, one would think, wouldn't have been as swayed by the influence of Trump and American politics on Canada, and then second, Carney's limitations as a French speaker would have positioned Blanchet well. But it's been an unpredictable and unconventional election campaign. Yeah. And that's why I say, I think for our viewers who are with us, I think really to get a sense of where this election is going to go, seeing where the Liberals end up once we finalize the numbers in the province of Quebec will be really fundamental.
Yeah. Over 1,000 people on the stream. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. We will continue to gear up as we head towards the closure of polls in an hour and a half or so in Quebec and Ontario. And as Sean said, key numbers then. We just urge you, if you're enjoying the stream, we got some great guests teed up momentarily. Please share the link with friends and family. Do that through your chats. Do it through your email and, of course, your social feeds. We'd really appreciate bringing more people into this conversation. We're going to try to have an alternative take on the election results, but rage farming free. We're gonna remain civil and remain substantive here. I'm just gonna catch the eye of my producer Ellie and just see where we're at on our next guest. Melissa? Okay, let's go to Melissa. So a real pleasure to get a look ahead to Alberta, which is going to be absolutely key in this election and what happens next. Melissa Calouette, who is here, she's a founder and of Pocket Lobbyist, former special assistant to the Premier of Alberta. Melissa, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. So look, what is the mood right now on Election Day in Alberta? What are Albertans hoping is going to happen tonight? And is there a feeling out there, Melissa, that if the result isn't what the province would like, that there could be a counter reaction here, that there's a lot of frustration that's built up in the province, and the contemplation of another Liberal government could set some of your fellow Albertans on edge?
Yeah, so I mean, Albertans have understandably been very frustrated with the past decade of Liberal governments that have introduced policies that have been quite damaging to Alberta. From both a public policy perspective, but also from a national unity perspective. I mean, Alberta is very much seen as like a misbehaved kid in Confederation with the federal government right now. And I think that has really influenced as well how people think about Alberta. If you have not spent a lot of time in Alberta or you don't have a lot of connections to Alberta, it's sometimes difficult to understand how Albertans are feeling versus how, the left or progressives sort of ascribe Albertans as feeling. I think the Alberta mood is really interesting because it is a province like Saskatchewan that votes overwhelmingly conservative. I mean, if you look at the margins of victory in like 90% of the seats in Alberta, they're quite large for the Conservatives. And so it's obviously always a typical safe province for the Conservatives. But what I think is really interesting that's happened since the last election in 2021, we've had actually a lot of interprovincial migration to Alberta, particularly to Calgary, where I live. I'm originally from Edmonton. And so it's very interesting, too. So you see in these inner city ridings in Calgary, more Eastern and coastal Western Canadians joining Calgary, ironically coming to the province because of the economic opportunity. And so do I think that that's going to have a massive impact on swinging some of these seats? Perhaps, but I think it's really interesting how that's played into the political culture as well. We had a provincial election last year, and Danielle Smith, as a leader, still has pretty strong support in the polls, but definitely a little bit more polarizing than we've seen previous leaders. So it's a very interesting dynamic in terms of the tone.
Yeah, that's great analysis, Melissa. And precisely where I wanted to go next, you mentioned that you've lived in both Calgary and Edmonton. As we await the Alberta results, let's pull up a bit and just talk about some of those broader trends in Alberta politics. Given the large migration into Calgary and Edmonton, both from the rest of Canada and elsewhere in the world, we're seeing some evidence that it's having an influence on Alberta's political culture. You talked about the growing competitiveness of the New Democrats provincially. There's the fact that the Calgary's mayor, I would argue, is amongst the most progressive in the country, including other big cities. Is there a world where, not necessarily in this election campaign, but in future ones, Alberta becomes purple, which is to say it no longer is a reliable source of overwhelming Conservative seats in the national parliament, but we start to see support from the different parties from Alberta and Ottawa? And if so, what should we look for in tonight's results that might point in that direction?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely possible. I think that what would probably have to happen to create that opportunity is that we would probably, not that I'm saying this should happen, but we would probably have to see an example of a Liberal Prime Minister that does not actively dismiss Alberta's concerns and ignore the economic issues that have been largely from federal policy. And so I think that if we see tonight the margins of victory narrow in rural Alberta And even if they're not flipping seats, I would look at the margins of victory. And then I would just also look to, there's 4 seats currently in Alberta or at dissolution that were not conservative. Alberta actually got 3 more seats as part of the redistribution, which has changed some of the boundaries, et cetera. So I would look to see if the Conservatives are able to at least keep the 30 that they have. If the Liberals are competitive in like 4 to 7 seats, then that would be a signal that perhaps folks are more open. But again, even if the Liberals do get that opportunity and there is a minority government with the Liberals, I think that Albertans could very quickly never do that again in a following election if they don't think that it yielded any success. I think Mark Carney has brought a unique sort of question mark to whether or not that's possible, because he does seem to have somewhat of more of a willingness to work with Alberta, certainly more than Trudeau did. But many of the policies that are fundamental to Alberta's economic success are still on the table. And now that, Carney has to, if he does form another government, if he'll have to work with an increasingly progressive coalition of folks in his party. So I just don't know how we would square the circle with that.
Yeah.
How he would square the circle internally.
Great analysis, Melissa. And let's stay on that point. Obviously, the ultimate outcome is to be determined. But if I could just follow what you said, in a scenario where we have a Liberal government, whether it's a minority or majority, talk a bit about what steps it would need to take to demonstrate to Albertans that even though they voted overwhelmingly for Conservatives, likely something in the range of 57 to 65% across the province, that Albertans will be able to find themselves inside or see themselves inside the government, particularly on decision making of great importance to the province, including regulatory reform, the oil and gas emissions cap, the negotiations with the Trump administration, et cetera. If you were advising a newly elected Prime Minister Carney, what would you recommend he do to try to assure Albertans that, while they may not win every policy fight, that they can see themselves and see their interests and values reflected in a Carney government?
I think a couple of things. So I think this may seem counterintuitive, but if I were Mark Carney and I formed another government, I would make my first trip to Alberta. Yeah. And that trip would be very publicly, please don't want to leave Confederation. Please don't, what can we do to keep you happy and engaged as part of Confederation? Now, do I think these calls for separation and all these other things are super intense in the province? No, but I do think that there's a very active cohort in the province that can be pretty easily delegitimized if there's even a small amount of willingness to compromise shown right off the bat from the Prime Minister, and to show that that's not only something that he's willing to do, but a priority in his first 100 days or however many. I do think that would make a huge difference. And I think just, small things too, just in how we talk about Alberta and how we talk about the economic contributions. There's in Alberta, we always talk about equalization, and we can get into the math and the reasons for all that. But, Albertans, I think, just want to hear that the rest of Canada appreciates the economic force that we've been able to contribute, and that, even if we think differently politically, even if we're culturally different, that's the beauty of Canada, and we should all be able to cohabitate and work together for the best interest, especially with the existential threats we're facing from south of the border.
Hear, hear. Let's go to our chat and see if we can get a couple questions for you from the group, see what people are thinking about issues around unity, how this country comes out of this election. Is it more or less divided? Elia, any of those themes coming out in the chat this last little bit?
A few people were asking whether young people were going to flee Canada. So a little bit of that nonsense in the chat. We had another question from Jeff, though. Jeff's asking, if the incumbent Prime Minister loses the seat count but still forms government, should we update our national motto to close enough?
Let's talk a little bit, Melissa, about that kind of doomsday scenario and how Albertans would react to a reality where it's a minority parliament. The Pierre Poilievre has won the plurality of the vote. but Carney, let's say, plus the rump of NDP, or I don't know, some smattering of Bloc MPs, is able to convince the Governor General that he should meet the House first, that he should test confidence because he is the Prime Minister. How do you think people in Alberta would react to that type of scenario?
That would not be good. Like, I don't know what else to say about that. That would not be good. I mean, we are already seeing these embers of the S word that I'm calling it. And that is not a situation that we're facing right now. So I do think, like, if Carney is serious about national unity, if Carney is serious about being, this leader that we need for our time, then I think that's opportunity number one. If that opportunity were to arise, I do think that would do some pretty irreparable damage to the relationship with Alberta. And frankly, it would just drive people more to the extremes. It would make the left feel emboldened in their point of view, like some of the news stories that we're seeing that Alberta should just leave. And it would make the people on the very far right that think that's a better alternative feel that way too. And so I think from a leadership perspective, he should not do that. And I think if you care about Canada, you do the right thing in that situation. Even if you don't have to be constitutionally coquettish in that situation, you can do the right thing to make Canadians believe and feel like you do have the whole country's best interest at heart.
Melissa, great sentiments. I hope those wise words fall on lofty ears after this campaign and election is all tied up later tonight. So thank you so much for coming on the program and sharing your perspective from Alberta. It's an important one, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, Sean, you can see I've doffed the vest. It got very hot in here. You're doing much better than me. I don't know. I mean, I live in Canada. You're spending a lot of time in New York City with your family. I guess you're just getting acclimatized to that Brooklyn kind of hot, sweaty summers. Your body is just adjusted
That's right. It's either that or I'm concealing my buttons that are holding on tightly after all that pizza tonight.
Yeah, well, we'll get more of that. What we're going to do in a moment, Sean, is we're going to bring in Theo Argyris, who is our much loved and much appreciated editor-at-large for economics and business at the Hub. He's been following the betting markets, and the betting markets are a fantastic kind of proxy for polling. They were super accurate in the elections as they came up in the United States in this cycle. And a lot of people thought, hey, maybe the betting market is what I should be watching as opposed to election polls. So Theo's going to come on and give us a little bit of a sense, Sean, about what these markets are showing and in fact, what they're even showing tonight. So if our team who's busy getting Theo seated here in the studio can call up the Polymarkets webpage, we'll see in Theo if we can get that up and then have you talk. I just got you to scooch in a little bit just so we get you close to the mic. You're a tall guy. And then I've got to get your tall head here in the camera shot.
As they're doing that, Theo, maybe I just ask, you were on tour with Mark Carney in the final days of the campaign. Maybe just big picture, why don't you reflect on what you saw and what you heard and what signs you took from the campaign about the way it was feeling about tonight's results.
And just, Theo, before you do that, maybe just because you're new to the audience, maybe just explain a bit about your background and why you were so excited to get out on the campaign trail.
Well, I was a journalist for a very long time. I still am. I left journalism for a few years before joining the Hub. But before I went into public affairs for a couple of years, I was a member of the press gallery in Ottawa for about 20 years.
Wow.
And so I've been covering elections very closely since 2006. 2005-2006 election was my first election, and I've covered every single one since then. So
that's great.
So it was nice it was very familiar for me to go back onto the campaign trail.
Yeah. So to answer Sean's question, what was your sense of of the Carney campaign in these final days as you kind of tagged along to see his interaction with the media, your fellow colleagues, and more importantly, I guess those press conferences are challenging to get much out of them, but if you could get a feeling for his mood, where his head's at.
I mean, it was a front runners campaign. Very, very careful,
Yes.
very disciplined. The message was very disciplined. It was. I was at the final press conference of the campaign on Saturday. At that point, when you're a front runner, you're not really very experimental. You're not going to be taking any risks, and that's kind of what we saw with the Carney campaign. And they've been ahead in the polls really since the beginning.
Yes.
And people were not sure whether it was just kind of like a temporary bounce in the polls, but he held the lead. He kept, the ballot question around Trump kind of was the main kind of issue that people were, talking about during the campaign, and he was, very, very careful to not veer away from the message. So it was a front runner's campaign.
Yeah. Let's get the latest Polymarket graph here up on the screen. So for those of us who are not, wow, look at that. So for those of us who are not aware of what the heck Polymarket is, Theo, what the heck is Polymarket?
Well, I mean, it's an online betting market, just like any kind of sports betting market online. This is a online betting market that you can bet on many things, and if you go through it, everything from politics to culture to who the next pope will be. So what we're seeing there is actually a pretty dramatic turn in the odds. It was about 80% maybe an hour ago that Carney would be the next prime minister.
And look, I'm looking at these numbers here at the bottom. 22 million and 40 million. Is that right? I mean, that's the volume of wagers. So this is real money at play here. I don't know, Theo, you study a lot of economics and business. How does this work, vis-a-vis polling? Like, what's its accuracy, or what's its pedigree?
I started following Polymarket when it accurately predicted Donald Trump's victory in November. At the time, the polls were the public opinion polls were actually very close, and it was Polymarket that had been predicting that a clear victory for Trump. And the reason why I look first at these betting markets, in particular Polymarket, is this is where people are putting their money at stake, right?
Yeah,
it's not just polling. And the interesting thing in the Trump presidential race, or the U.S. presidential race that led to the Trump victory, there was this one kind of famous bettor. I think they called him the Trump whale, who had put all this money into Trump. And the reason, and after the election campaign, they found this kind of individual betting on Trump, and he had done his own individual polling.
Yeah, he polled everybody. What do you think your neighbors
are?
How are your neighbors going to vote? And he
right.
used that as a proxy to actually find out what people really wanted to vote, because there was such a kind of queasiness about telling a pollster that you were actually going to vote for Trump.
That's right. But the interesting thing about Polymarket is it has been consistently predicting a Carney victory for many weeks.
Yeah, well, you can see that going back to April. But what do you make, Theo, of this plunge that we're seeing over the last few hours? What is going on here?
I think the results coming in from Atlantic Canada may be looking a little bit better for the Conservatives than anybody expected. I think I haven't looked at the latest results from Elections Canada, but I think the numbers may be coming in a little bit better out of Atlantic Canada.
Well, we talked to David Tarrant, a leading political strategist in the Maritimes, who told us upside for the Conservatives was double digits. And right now they are leading in, it looks to me, 10 or 11 seats.
Yes.
So on the high end of Tarrant's analysis. And so that may explain may explain what's seeing here. If I could just make one other point about what we're seeing from Atlantic Canada so far, not just Rudyard and Theo, that the Conservatives seem to be pushing up against that ceiling that Terrence shared with us, but also that they are outperforming polling in the region. And the reason why that's important is if the Conservatives are ultimately going to win this election, it's going to be because they outperform polls over not just recent days, but really throughout this campaign. And so the gains that they're making relative to the final polling numbers from Atlantic Canada, I think, is giving Conservatives a bit of a sense of optimism that they may be able to outperform polls in other parts of the country. And indeed, that may be why we're seeing this jump in Polymarket in the past half hour or so.
And if we go back to the Polymarket website, you'll see lower down, you'll see some other questions or some other bets, including whether the Liberals would be winning a majority. And
just one sec, I'll ask the team here. Can we bring up the Polymarket graph again? Yeah.
If we go down the website, if you go down, scroll
down the page there, Elliot. Thanks, if that's possible. I think we're projecting, so it may be hard for us to do that.
So what we had seen earlier today was Liberal majority being priced in at around 2/3 probability, and now it's gone below 50%.
Wow.
So.
Wow. Well.
Go back to Polymarket. It was flashing there. Something was going on. Look at these bets. They're coming in live. Those two lines are going to meet. I mean, that's taking us back to
Oh, yeah. Look at that. 50. Look at that.
Look at that.
This is
wow,
better,
guys,
this is better than the ponies.
You're not seeing this on the CBC, guys. This ain't on Rosie Barton's. Not.
They are
on
almost
Polymarket.
50-50. That is quite incredible. What a dramatic turn, and that's only in the past half an hour.
Yes.
Yeah, this is so cool, Theo. I'm really glad you brought this to our attention. You've covered Mark Carney for a long time in Ottawa when he was governor of the Bank of Canada. If this is a Liberal loss, let's just hypothesize here. If the Conservatives can eke out a government, does Mark Carney stick around?
I think he has to stick around.
Yeah.
I mean, I think
for a decent amount of time or a long time. They're two different things.
Well, I mean, I think he'll play it by ear. You're
Okay.
right. He'll gauge the probabilities of becoming prime minister. I don't think if he doesn't see a path towards becoming prime minister, I don't think there's going to be a long kind of tenure there as opposition leader.
Right.
If he thinks that, I mean, if it's a majority Conservative government, which I would love to see what the Polymarket probability is for that. I mean, I think it's over for Mark Carney. If it's a minority government with a chance of an election within 18 months, I think he probably sticks around.
Right. Yeah. Sean, what do you think?
Well, Theo, as Rudyard said, we're so lucky to have you to be able to draw on not just your journalistic experience, but your business and economic analysis, something that you've already demonstrated in the brief time you've been with us, and certainly you will after this election campaign. One of the issues that really has been at the heart of this election is whether we ought to be more focused on Trump's threats to Canada or whether we need to focus more on what I would argue are the bigger, more secular challenge, which is economic stagnation. Mm-hmm. That's reflected in low business investment, declining productivity, and of course declining living standards over the past several years. Are you surprised at all, Theo, that those issues, at least on the nose, didn't loom as large in the campaign as we might have liked? And to what extent do you think an incoming government will have a mandate to carry out the types of reforms that we need to get our economy growing faster?
Yeah. I think there's kind of three big issues for the next government, whoever that is. I think one big issue, obviously, is how we reset the relationship with the U.S.
Yes.
And another big issue, obviously, is kind of how do we get the economy moving again? How do we get investment back into the economy? And I think both of the leaders had messages on that front. They both had plans, their own plans. It's very different plans, but they both spoke of the need to create more investment in the economy. And so I think that, even you said that, the issue was kind of the campaign was mostly focused on Trump. But I think, and which obviously was advantage for Carney.
Yes.
I think Carney did produce his own kind of robust economic plan. We know who he is, what type of government he will be. Very kind of using the government balance sheet, using the state as a vehicle to help propel more investment. I think Poilievre is more free market type. Would be a more free market type of prime minister, trying to kind of promote private sector growth. So I think they're both talking about economic growth. I don't think you can argue that Carney didn't have some type of plan there. So I think that will be kind of an important kind of agenda item for either prime minister.
And then you said there was a third. You don't leave the last one out.
I'm trying to remember. So there was the second one was resetting.
Theo, you're going to have lots of time to come back on the roundtable here over the course of this evening, because we want you to be watching for cool indicators out there. Let's get the Polymarket thing back on. I think it's getting even more exciting. Look at that. They're about to touch.
No, they moved again. There you go.
They moved again?
So very volatile. 60 back to 68. You see?
Okay.
I mean, we're seeing betting in real time.
Yeah.
Well, the chart hasn't moved, but
I see
the numbers are
moving,
there.
Okay, that's fascinating. We'll continue to follow this over the course of the night. Thanks for bringing it to our attention, Theo. We'll say goodbye to you now and bring our next guest, but we'll definitely have you back as we move towards polls closing in Ontario, Quebec, and our western provinces. So, Sean, what do you make of this? Looks like a little bit better performance than was expected. So now we go into Quebec. If we see a little more, again, solidity here in the Conservative vote, could we be, if it's not a tsunami, could we be seeing a wave here beginning to lap from east to west through Quebec into Ontario? I guess we'll know in the next few hours.
If these numbers hold up, the Conservatives, as David said, will feel pretty good coming out of the Maritimes. They managed to minimize a Liberal sweep and set themselves up to fight another day. The real test, Rudyard, will be what Quebecers do in terms of setting the Liberals up for a possible majority. If they can't make major gains in the province of Quebec, particularly given their weaknesses west of the Lakehead, the arithmetic for the Liberals to get to the magic number of 172 will be really hard, especially given how the Conservatives performed in the Maritimes. So I don't want to say that the Liberal aspirations run through the province of Quebec, but I think that'll be a big part of the story for them.
Yeah. Well, one big part of the election 2025 story was energy. These two parties vying with different policies and platforms to, from words of Mark Carney, make Canada into an energy superpower. Pierre Poilievre promising big, bold moves on pipelines and energy corridors. To help unpack all of this and figure out where the heck we ended this campaign on energy, it's a real pleasure to welcome to the studio one of our favorite commentators on all things energy. She's Heather Exner-Perot. She's the Director of Energy, National Resources, and the Environment at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and a regular contributor to The Hub. Heather, great to have you here.
Great to be here in person.
I'm going to let Sean tee off this topic because I know it's close to his heart. Sean, what did you think? If you're thinking about Heather's expertise here and our listening audience, what do they need to understand that Heather can help explain in the context of energy in the election?
I think the big question for me, Heather, is there seemed to be a moment in the face of Trump's threats and provocations where Canadians from across the spectrum and across different provinces settled on the idea that we do indeed need to develop our energy resources across a spectrum from conventional oil and gas to, virtually everything in between. I guess the question for you is, did you see policy ideas from the two parties that would enable us to fulfill that vision of developing our resources and extracting the wealth and prosperity that they represent for the country?
Yeah, great question. So obviously there is a bit of a change or a shift in face of the Trump tariffs. But really for me, that shift had been happening for a few years. One is COVID, when the economy, tanked, and affordability, and I would say kind of the bottom of the hierarchy of needs started to exert itself. And that's where not interest in climate change, but the prioritization of climate change as a policy began to come down, I think. And then Russia invading Ukraine and the energy crisis, there was an energy crisis that followed there. It only touched Canada lightly, touched a lot of countries very heavily, but it touched Canada heavily or lightly. And that also swayed, I think, opinions that affordability is number one and reliability and security is pretty important. And then, so we are already seeing climate change going down on the list of priorities, energy coming up, and then Trump comes up with the tariffs. And for me, what that changed was the energy literacy of Canadians. That all of a sudden, the things that we talked about in downtown Calgary, like Pad 2, refinery complex in the Midwest, and, how many million barrels a day we send or not. All of a sudden, a lot of people knew that, and it was in a lot of articles, and people started to understand the scope of the resource that we have, and then maybe felt like sometimes Albertans do is, we're so happy we have this tremendous resource. How lucky are we to have this resource? And so I feel very strongly that the Conservatives were pushing this narrative, I would say, this whole time. But for the Liberals, it was the public opinion that pushed them to have to say things like, we want to be an energy superpower, and to have some more credible policies, not just on the climate front, but also on the energy front and on the export front. The economic growth front is what people were looking for. And if we are to be, a player, a G7 country in a scarier world, a more, turbulent world, well, having, the world's fourth largest reserves behind you is actually quite helpful, on top of the potash and the uranium and things that, people now know about. So in terms of the policies, the CEOs, the 14 CEOs of Canada's biggest energy companies, put out their letter right before the election, said pretty clearly, and I thought pretty constructively, what they expected to see, what would help them invest. For me, that letter is, this is how to get us to spend money in your country. This is how to reattract capital. And the Conservatives came out pretty clearly and said, we agree with it all. Yeah, nothing, very reasonable. We've been saying all these things already, frankly, for 2 years. And the Liberals, not quite, where Carney has been hedging quite a bit. So certainly positive. I don't mean to diminish that. The whole conversation has been much more positive than anyone, I think, in downtown Calgary could have hoped a year ago. But still a lot of hedging coming from the Carney camp, and I think recognizing that they are trying to build a coalition across, the left spectrum, across the left side, and there's still some climate voters that they have to get.
So let me follow up. Let me put that to you directly, because the two, as I see it, the two policy areas where the Carney-led Liberals didn't match the Conservatives when it came to energy is, first, he wouldn't commit to repealing Bill 69, which has been a bit of a lightning rod around the regulatory and permitting process. And the second is he committed to maintaining the emissions cap on the oil and gas sector. If I just put it to you bluntly, if those two policies remain in place, is it possible to build oil and gas pipelines in Canada?
I mean, not an inch of it. No one's going to build northern. So what are we talking about? I think there has been, even at the BC government and at the Liberal government, and certainly with the Conservatives, LNG is popular in this country. Like, well over 80% of Canadians support LNG, even in Quebec. Even in Quebec, they're having these discussions about the LNG in Sacadé. So the next big project that is in the process is Silesums in BC. There's LNG Canada Phase 2, which is just waiting for a final investment decision. It's been approved. That would be a game changer. And then Silesums, which would come with a new natural gas export pipeline. It's already in the system. I feel confident. The mood has shifted. We're going to get that one. So the real difference for me is, are we going to get a Northern Gateway or not? Yes. And I think under the Conservatives and under Polliev, they would do the work. The heavy lifting has to be done by government now, because Trans Mountain was such a disaster, because CGL also was overcost. A government is going to have to come in and provide a lot of carrots to get a proponent to want to spend that money. I think the Conservatives would do that. I don't think the Liberals will do that.
A couple other questions for you. One of the things, in addition to your expertise on energy and the environment, you're also one of Canada's leading voices when it comes to Indigenous participation in energy development. And it seems to me this is an area where there has indeed been a sea change. I was part of the Harper government that reforms the regulatory system in the SIA reforms in 2012. And I'm embarrassed to say the subject of Indigenous participation was just not part of that conversation, not out of malevolence, out of mostly ignorance. And
citizens against corporations.
Yes.
And there's kind of a bit of an anti-capitalist sentiment in that. When you start to understand it from the industry's perspective, I mean, it's hard to raise capital in this world. It's hard to deploy it. Canada's regulatory system is obviously lacking. There's not a lot of great places in this world to go extract oil and go, mine nickel and lithium. So very hard to raise the money, and especially where we have been in a commodity cycle, where we've been in kind of the bust cycle for the last 10 years, where it's almost impossible to raise capital for junior miners. And so you just get the other side that far from them trying to go everywhere and develop everything, it's a struggle to get the money, to do the work, to get through the regulation, to develop and so we have forgotten that you actually have to attract capital. That is the fundamental thing that this country, you just take for granted that capital will come and that you don't have to do anything to attract it. And as a result, we've seen capital flight. And I always say we're like a frog boiling in water, because I think we were so wealthy, or we've been so comfortable, that for 10 years, that standard just, of living just deteriorated. The capital just deteriorated, the number of projects deteriorated. Now we're noticing, well, it's been a 10-year, movement. So we really have to get to that, where you appreciate capital, where you appreciate business. And I have to say, the capacity that a world-class sector brings, whether it's mining, hard projects to get through, and not even oil and gas, so it's tremendous, but like the potash mine in Saskatchewan, for example. We all were stunned when Elon Musk put his rocket ship, back on the podium. Wow, what a miracle. These guys just dug 2-kilometer-long tunnels down into the ground, met them at the bottom. There's a lot of things that, when you're going a kilometer down into the world, that you have to contend with. It is an engineering miracle what they've been able to accomplish. There's billions of dollars in investment to do it. And no one even knows that it happened. So part of it, too, is I think, this is my big theory of everything, Sean, is that we urbanized. People don't really appreciate where their food comes from, where their energy comes from, where the electricity comes from, where their materials come from, because they don't see it. All they see is the last stage of a very long supply chain, and they take it for granted, and it's a very lucky thing to take those things for granted. We're seeing in Spain, they're not able to take it for granted tonight. But anyways, we're far past time in Canada where we should be taking it for granted, and we should be looking at attracting that kind of capacity, that kind of investment, those kinds of human resources.
Well, our viewers just get to see Heather, and why we're so lucky to have Heather on our pages. We didn't even get into space mining, something we talked about previously. We have a back on after the election to talk about it. But Heather Exer-Perot, Director of Energy, Natural Resources and Environment at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your expertise with our audience, because, yes, of course, we're electing Prime Minister who is going to have a host of responsibilities, including negotiating a trade and security agreement with the United States. But ultimately, his, I suppose, success or failure will look like whether we're able to push the economy in a better and different direction, and that's going to involve developing Canada's rich bounty of natural resources. So thank you so much.
My pleasure to be here, gentlemen.
Thank you, Heather. Well, real pleasure now to welcome on to the program the past Premier of Alberta, Senior Advisor at Bennett Jones, Jason Kenney. Jason, thank you for finding time in a busy evening to join us here at the Hub. Greatly appreciate it.
Doing this from the belly of the beast at the Mother Corp over at CBC headquarters, which may not turn into a public housing project depending on tonight's result. Or this could be the penultimate broadcast for CBC English TV.
You are so bold, Jason, to go back to CBC after you were wrongly fact-checked online on air over the weekend. You really are a happy warrior.
Yeah.
Well, I figured, some sensible conservative has to show up here because there's, like a third of English Canada, largely those old boomers who are voting Carney tonight, who I'd like to remind them that there are some conservatives who can put a sentence together.
Hear, hear.
Well, more than a couple, Jason. So let's start with your just thoughts on how this election ended, Jason. I personally felt a bit of frustration that we did not in this campaign get to the host of issues that we knew were facing the country going into it. We spent a lot of time talking about known unknowns in the form of Donald Trump and not a lot of time talking about known knowns. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree in part. Let me start with the positives in that actual leadership debate. And by the way, let me just start there. If you really want to have a serious substantive discussion that's beyond sound bites, it has to be between the two principal leaders who are vying for prime minister. And there should be two debates, like one bucket focused on foreign trade, international security, defense policy, and one focused on domestic policy issues, it seems to me. It seems to me Canadian voters deserve that as a table stakes for serious electoral debate. That's point one. But positively, as an Albertan, I was very happy, as somebody who's been identifying our enormous undeveloped energy resources as Canada's trump card, so to speak. I was very happy that energy policy played a much larger role in that debate than any Canadian political debate. And I think that demonstrates that we have been, in being rumbled by Trump, we've been mugged by reality, and even many people in the center left who entertained all sorts of fantasies about net zero and rapid and stranded oil and gas and rapid decarbonization now realize that if we are going to strengthen our economy, our national prosperity, to compete with, to be resilient against American aggression, to diversify our export markets in meaningful ways, then we need to get that energy to global markets. So I think there's been apparently an inflection point. I'm a little skeptical about how deep Mark Carney's commitment is to that. So I think that's a positive in terms of the debate. What I have found frustrating is that so much of the debate coming from the Liberals and much of the Laurentian Canadian commentariat has been that, we need to focus on defending ourselves from Donald Trump. And Poilievre is all about slogans. Granted, Pierre's never been, there's been no paucity on Pierre's part during his leadership when it comes to identifying effective slogans. But I think he's been at least as detailed, and more so, in fact, than Mr. Carney on how to deal with Trump. But here's my point. What have the Liberals actually said about the defense or offense strategy contra Trump? Dollar for dollar reciprocal targeted tariffs, being strong, and then we get into cloud cuckoo land, like through fiat, creating an entirely independent Canadian domestic auto manufacturing industry. Maybe I'm being, look, you guys have followed this more closely than me. You've been doing content on it every day. But I'm kind of trying to identify where's the daylight between the Conservatives and Liberals on fighting Donald Trump, and where's the actual substantive outline on that? Like when Carney was challenged in the leaders' debate on this, I can barely recall what his answers were.
Yes.
So I think, unfortunately, the drama around Trump crowded out a lot of substantive discussion on the essential radical economic reforms that the Hub's been advocating.
Yeah, well said. I said it at various points over this campaign, Jason, that if you took what Poilievre has said about Canada-U.S. relations and Trump and what Carney has said and you remove attribution, it would be virtually impossible for Canadians to distinguish them. And yet Carney's had this huge advantage on that question based on whatever one calls it, intuition, vibes. Whatever.
I call it vibes. I think so much of this campaign has been characterized by vibes, by image, by brand. And in that, Pierre's had let's face it, a natural disadvantage. He's a generation younger than Mr. Carney. He doesn't have the same resume depth. Mr. Carney presents like a banker, economist, sophisticated business guy from Hollywood Central Casting. And Mr. Poilievre has been, I think, the most effective opposition leader in our lifetime, perhaps in post-war Canadian history, demonstrated by his defenestration of Justin Trudeau, his running a 25-point lead for the better part of 18 months, the biggest fundraising record of any party in history.
Yes.
And most importantly, defining the issue matrix around affordability and cost of living, turning the retail carbon tax into an avatar for those issues.
Yes.
Being well ahead of the curve with source credibility on inflation, as he was calling it in COVID, one of the only opposition leaders I've ever known to speak about monetary policy and thoughtfully. So I think he's been a hugely effective opposition leader, too effective, because he auditioned so aggressively for the role of opposition leader. I think when it came time to compare him to the calm, cool, and collected global banking genius, the resume, the brand, the vibes were hard to compete with. So I think a lot of this was baked in like the first 2 weeks of Carney coming on board.
Yes.
When older voters who identify with him said he's a safe pair of hands, and there was really no substantive clash on how to deal with the Americans or with Trump.
Jason, there's so many questions to put to you. I know you don't have a lot of time with us, but with the exception of Pierre Poilievre, you're amongst the only people I know who speak to conservative voters, in muscle memory. And who's someone who, of course, who's spent a lifetime in conservative politics. Talk a bit about what we've seen over the past several weeks. Not just the party pushing up to amongst its higher levels of popular support since the party was created earlier this century, but also an interesting change in the composition of conservative voters, building on your efforts with New Canadians, but also with Realignment voters, those working in blue-collar trades and so on. What does this represent, not just in this election, but for the future of conservative politics in Canada?
Well, it is too early to say. I mean, we can talk about what Pierre's effort has been, but the early results out of Atlantic Canada, I'm just looking at the update here. It looks like Conservatives will come out maybe 1 or 2 seats ahead of where they were in Atlantic Canada. And certainly I'm here at CBC where 20 minutes ago they showed popular vote shift in Atlantic Canada with the NDP dropping by 12 points and the Liberals up by 6, the Tories up by 12. There were other shifts, the PPC dropping from like 4 or 5. They were very strong in New Brunswick last time, shifting to Conservatives. So look, first of all, on the tail wagging the dog side of things, the Poilievre strategy in terms of the populist tone seems to have been effective at suppressing the PPC vote, which did play a critical role in a number of swing ridings last time. And that is speaking to frustrated working people.
Yes.
Secondly, the very deliberate outreach to private sector working people in blue-collar trades, people who don't have university degrees, so far seems to have been very effective. He's certainly won far, by orders of magnitude, more endorsements from private sector unions or unions generally than any conservative leader or campaign that I can recall.
Yes.
In the past, we might have received 1 or 2 from police unions or the customs union, but never have we received, and occasionally we would get the odd local from a building trade. But here we've had dozens of endorsements broadly from the industrial unions, the building trades unions, and that has not happened by accident. Now, and then thirdly, you see, of course, what appears to be in the polling is, for the first time, a significant conservative lead amongst younger voters.
Yes.
And we seemed, again, in the polling, seemed to be doing pretty well amongst immigrants. That's something that I spent 15 years of my life on. If the polling is accurate, the party will certainly be increasing its support demonstrably amongst New Canadians, primarily of East and South Asian origin. So, and he's made a big effort on that too, to his great credit, by the way. The last 2 or 3 conservative leaders kind of, they did not give that adequate attention or resources to move the dial.
Yes.
So you throw all of those things in together, and what you see is a quite different conservative electorate. It's lower income. It has less levels of formal academic education. It has less of a stake on the asset side of the economy. It is more susceptible to economic shocks and downturns, to recessions, to tariffs, and as well to crime. It also has more, that electorate, what John Howard, the former Aussie Prime Minister, referred to as the battlers.
Yes.
Or, Margaret Thatcher referred to as the aspirational voters. These people are also the most vulnerable to deteriorating public services and state capacity, because they do not play golf with the local specialist to jump the queue on the surgery list. They don't live in a gated community. They are more susceptible to crime, social disorder, the consequences of the addictions crisis, et cetera. So if tonight, if Pierre actually realizes these results and comes in close to 40% or better, with that being the driving demography in his coalition, it will be an upending of the traditional voting patterns in Canada.
Yeah, well said. I characterized them this morning, Jason, disproportionately as the losers of the Liberal lost decade. And I think, as you say, a big question moving forward is how can Pierre Poilievre and future Conservative leaders continue to bring these voices and perspectives within a Conservative governing coalition and indeed a Conservative policy agenda. I know as you something that you took seriously in your time in Alberta, which leads me to the inevitable question about Alberta. Jason, you've been an outspoken critic over the past several weeks about those voices in the province talking about separation. But of course, there's going to be a considerable number of Albertans, a significant majority, in fact, that vote for Conservatives and yet may not get the government they want for the fourth time in 4 election campaigns. Talk a bit about what you're hearing and seeing on the ground in the province, and what we can do within our politics to make sure that Alberta's voice and perspective is indeed reflected at the table and in federal policymaking.
Well, the frustrations are real, and the worst thing to do is to deny or diminish them. But it's also unhelpful to exaggerate and amplify them. The conversation usually quickly moves to, I think, the rather false debate around separation. Look, the idea of separation, there have been semi-organized, quasi-organized separatist parties, movements, candidates in Alberta on and off since the early 1980s, since the catastrophic national energy program.
Yes.
And yet, in all of that time, in 45 years, so we're talking probably a dozen federal and a dozen provincial elections, give or take, over those 45 years. The Separatists have managed to win 1 seat, which was in rural central Alberta in 1982, at the height of the NEP, with a Western Canada concept candidate. So this stuff has never been affirmed at the ballots, at the ballot box, at the polling stations, unlike at Quebec. And by the way, 1982, Alberta has changed radically in terms of its demography and political culture since 1982 because of in-migration from across Canada as the largest recipient of interprovincial migration. So typically you go door to door in Calgary, Fort McMurray, or Red Deer. Every other house is going to be someone who moved from another part of Canada. And then through immigration, we receive a disproportionate share of immigrants from abroad. Those overwhelmingly Canadian migrants and international immigrants have as their principal loyalty Canada. A lot of them become natural Alberta Conservatives, and they pick up their historical grievances and they start to understand, they get ticked off why Ottawa wants to constantly compress our biggest industry. They share those frustrations, but separatism is not a question for them. So you've got about 10 or 15% who are the hardcore, overwhelmingly rural separatist types. When there are flare-ups from federal policy, from federal Liberals campaigning against us, you will get like a 30% pro-separatist generic number in a poll, but I think about half of that are people using it as a proxy to express their frustration. Sure. So don't exaggerate it, but don't diminish it. I rush to add, no one was talking about that stuff when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, or for that matter, when Jean Chrétien was approving all of the major oil sands projects. And was balancing the budget. And, he was not hugely popular in Alberta, but not hugely despised either. So I point out, look, there are structural problems in Canada vis-a-vis the West. Those are amplified by Liberal governments who have been obsessed by green ideology as opposed to a prosperity agenda. But it is connected more to a temporal political program than the structure of the federation. So I think that has to be our starting point. And I always say that you cannot and should not be a Canadian leader if your commitment to the federation is a conditional. Like that's why I'm an unconditional Canadian, and I think the vast majority of Albertans are too.
Yeah.
Jason, how are you for time? I know you've got a busy night tonight.
I got time.
Okay, we've got some questions.
Before Rosemary Barton bumps you, I'm good.
Let's get some questions from our live chat audience, thousands of people that are on the stream right now. Let's go to Elliot Gross, and we'll get the first question for Jason.
All right. A good friend of the Hub, Joseph Lavoie from Crestview, is asking Jason, should the West feel like it's been left out again? And what does the next government need to do to stem the expected rise in anger and frustration?
Yeah, well, if Mr. Carney wins tonight, there will be honestly very deep frustration because, the Alberta perspective. By the way, when we say the West, let me make a distinction here. When most of us say the West, what we're thinking of is the resource-producing parts of the West, which would be most of Manitoba, all of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the interior of BC. So the GV, Greater Vancouver region, is culturally and economically different, and to a large extent, Winnipeg is as well. But that West, the resource-producing West,
right,
cannot understand how the rest of Canada could re-elect this government after the last 10 years. It is inconceivable. And given Mark Carney's deep, it's apparently almost like mystical commitment to this sort of green left decarbonization agenda, there is great anxiety about what the implications of that are. Now, I would say, I'm obviously rooting for Poilievre government here, but if that happens, our Western leaders and our industry leaders are going to have to be smart about how they play this. And immediately going into like full throttle battle with a new leader who has signaled some openness to pipelines and to increased energy production, I think would be imprudent. I think we should start out by seeing if we can find we in the West, Alberta in particular, the oil and gas industry can find a modus vivendi, a way of working with that government. It's something that I sought with Justin Trudeau, but could never get out of him. Now, I have a lot of liberal friends, blue liberal friends, who swear to me up and down that Mark Carney's the real deal. He really means it when he says Canada has to become an energy superpower. He's really going to help us build pipelines. I say to them, then why the hell is Stephen Guilbeault still in his cabinet? Mm-hmm. And some of these other holdovers from the Trudeau administration. So if he wins, I say, let's at first give him the benefit of the doubt, take him at his word, making Canada an energy superpower. And, by the way, that's what the oil industry's been trying to do, for example, with the Pathways Initiative, signaling a willingness to spend tens of billions of dollars pretty rapidly to decarbonize their operations. So there is potential common ground here. Yeah. I would say if he wins, let's try to find that first.
Yeah. No, you've actually heard Mark Carney mention Pathways as a project that's an important one and that needs permissions, which have not been forthcoming to allow them to move forward with large-scale carbon sequestration. Jason, Rosemary's knocking on the door, but we're going to try to get one more in with you. Let's go to the live chat here. Elliot, another question for the Premier.
Another good friend of the Hub, Neo, our favorite. What concerns does Mr. Kenney have about OPEC, and does he have any thought on the initial OPEC production increase at the start of COVID when the demand slumped?
Yeah, well, Hiram, yes, I certainly do. I think the day was March the 6th, 2020, when I learned, somebody told me that the Amex global billings for February were down by 50%, which made me swallow my stomach. And at the same time, I learned that the talks between Russia and OPEC had broken down in Vienna. And OPEC had decided to surge supply. And in the face of catastrophic demand destruction, that increase in supply meant a total overnight collapse of oil prices. And I think by the first week of April, we were trading in negative oil territory. Alberta revenues collapsed. We would typically book about $10 billion in revenues on oil and gas rents and royalties. It was going to zero. We couldn't sell Alberta government bonds. And we started to do some emergency cash management with the possibility that by June we wouldn't be able to refinance our debt obligations, and so it was like a bona fide crisis. And I tried to raise the flag on this with Trudeau and company to say, look, by the way, it was so bad that we were, because there was nowhere to store the oil being produced. There was no one buying it. Refineries were shutting down in the US. We were concerned that it could cause the oil sands operators to effectively turn off the steam that goes into their SAGD projects, permanently wrecking some of those enormous reservoirs. So it was a real crisis. Thank God we got through it, but it just shows how big that the impact is in that industry on the broader Canadian economy, on our dollar, on employment, on revenues, on everything.
Jason, you just got a firsthand insight into the quality of audience members here we have at the Hub. Those are the types of questions we've gotten from our live community every day during this campaign. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, sharing your insights, and hopefully we'll have you back on after election to talk about what it means for Canada and some of the broader trends that we only started to touch on tonight, including Conservative gains with younger voters, the political realignment, and what this all makes for Canadian conservatism.
Yeah, can I just close by thanking you guys for the vision and hard work to start this uncertain enterprise at first, and which has been vindicated in this campaign, being a thoughtful hub of, pardon the phrase, pardon the pun, for policy discourse on the center right that's outside of the party context and is truly independent. That's hugely important. I've got I'm ready to, when somebody in the CBC tonight tells me that if Pierre loses because he was too right-wing, I'm going to point out that this was a campaign that endorsed new liberal entitlement programs, is the first Conservative campaign since the 1980s not to commit to a balanced budget, is committed on bioethical issues like euthanasia and others to pretty much the most liberal policy setting in the developed world, and is not proposing cuts in high marginal tax rates or corporate taxes, at least not yet. This was not a right-wing platform. There might have been a populist tone, but this was not a right-wing platform. In other words, there's a lot of thinking for Conservatives to do after tonight about how we formulate and articulate an electorally viable but bold center-right strategy for renewing Canada, and I think you guys are going to be at the middle of that.
Well, thanks, Jason. And if we're just sharing compliments, let me just say to you that that crucial distinction between ideas on one hand and temperament on the other can often be confused, I think, by a lot of conservatives who've come to see conservatism as synonymous with being a jerk. And I think you and us and a lot of people think, no, conservatives about being smart and principled and winning the battle of ideas. We're grateful that you've done that over the course of your career. It's helped to inspire the work that we do here at the Hub and the important work that we'll do after this election campaign. So thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks for your time tonight. Well, real pleasure. Boy, the rock stars just keep filing into the studio. We got Janice Gross-Stein in the house, founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs, currently acting director of the Munk School of Global Affairs. Janice, so nice to have you here.
Great to be with the two of you.
Yeah, we've really enjoyed your foreign policy kind of comment and analysis as we had this crazy campaign with Trump at the center of it, tariffs dominating in the early weeks, kind of fading a bit as the campaign went on. How big a Trump effect do you think we've had? And I guess one thing we're interested about, we've seen in the polls a lot, a big demographic kind of split in terms of older Canadians seemingly more focused on the Trump issue, more concerned about issues of security and safety versus younger cohorts who seem more open to change. You teach young students. I do. You spend a lot of time with people in their 20s. What do you make of this generational divide in terms of how it plays out or perception of external threats, particularly Trump?
No, I think it's a hugely important issue for the future of the country, Rudyard, that we have young people focused on lack of growth, lack of opportunity, frustration. They can't buy a house. They don't think they can buy a house. Having kids is tough. That kind of thing. We've never seen a divide exactly like this before.
Yes.
And I think that's something that will outlast this election. At the same time, these very same people who tell me this, and I have huge sympathy will also complain that why is anybody intolerant of an LGBTQ person? They just don't get it. They simply don't get it. That's not who they are. And so they're struggling with the different strands, as you just talked about it, in conservatism. Many of them, by the way, are immigrants or children of immigrants. So any attack on immigrants. So I was just today with a group of young people in that demographic, and you heard this kind of conflict and tension playing itself out, really.
On the subject of conflict and tension, Janice, you've been a leading voice on Canada's relationship with China.
Right.
You played a role, if I understand correctly, on the development of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Trudeau government, which represented, in tone and substance, a shift in a lot of ways about how Canada thought about its relationship with China. I regret that subject is not one that got up a lot of attention in this election campaign. I think it's fair to say that we don't really know how the two major party leaders think about Canada's relationship with China. Why don't you just reflect on it, particularly in a context in which people are feeling increasingly like, in the face of the Trump administration, Canada needs to rethink its relationships around the world. What will land on the desk of the next prime minister when it comes to Canada-China relations?
And just before you do that, Janice, these mics are made in China, so you're going to have to get your mouth really, really close to them in order for us to hear you.
We don't have CBC's budget, I'm afraid.
Okay, great. Let me just share with all our viewers that there is a green room outside, or a waiting room, where some of the people are talking while you two are working. And Theo Argytis, who writes for the Hub, was there. And the two of us got into a heated discussion, not disagreement, but discussion exactly about that. What's the role of China? What's the role of manufacturing in the future economy?
Yes.
How do we create opportunity for our young people? And this is really unfair to Theo. He's not in the room. You have to get him in. But he said, look, China has, as I put it, I kicked this football over to him. China has the highest number of robots in its factories in the world, more than everyone else all over the world, right? So let's just look at that one factor. What does that mean? They're going to be the most efficient manufacturers in the world. Now look what a kind of bizarre discussion we're having about trade and manufacturing in the rest of the world, when the most efficient manufacturers are charging ahead at an incredible pace. I think one of the big things this election has really highlighted how important China is, the leverage China has in the world. When they cut off access to critical minerals, when their manufacturing sector is racing ahead, what does that tell all those young people about the role of China in the world? So Theo said to me, well, you know what's going to happen? We're just going to have less efficient manufacturing. We're going to be kind of walled off. And I answered back, are you telling me that we're going to have an inefficient, Rudyard is not going to like this.
Sounds like East Germany or something, on the wrong side of the Berlin Wall.
On the wrong side of history, that we're moving toward a world in which Europe and North America, in order to continue to make things, do it at higher prices, consume less. That is not a world that these young people in Canada really want to see.
So the best part about the Hub is that we have the best audience, as you know. And so you just talked about the trade-offs when it comes to efficiency. Quite literally, I just got this text from one of our audience members. Stein is a national treasure. Her Massey lecture on the cult of efficiency is wonderful and should be read more widely by conservatives grappling with the role of the state. So how do you answer that? You've just made the case, in effect, for prioritizing efficiency.
Yeah.
How do we think about that in a context of a cult of efficiency?
Well, in those lectures, I did make the argument that if you only value efficiency and you don't value anything else, you end up with a world that very few of us would live in or would want to live in. So your listener is absolutely right, absolutely. On the other hand, I don't think a world where we are knowingly less efficient and we wall ourselves off in order to protect ourselves That's the world that Trump is trying to create, I believe, in failing for the United States. That's not going to meet the expectations of these young people in our own country. So these are really big challenges. They got no airtime in this election, I understand. But whoever's in that prime minister's seat tomorrow, these are serious, tough economic challenges that this country has to address.
Indeed. Let's talk about another big question maybe that didn't get the airtime it deserved, guys, and that was the negotiation which will happen possibly quickly with the Trump administration. Both of these leaders understandably had to put down politically some markers, support for supply management, support for the auto sector, et cetera, but we really didn't get a sense, Janice, did we, about whether they accepted an argument that integration and continued integration was, in a sense, A, in Canada's interest, and B, even if you might not think that it's in Canada's interest, it might be inevitable.
Yeah.
A little bit disappointing maybe that we didn't have a sharper debate on that. Carney obviously talked a lot about trade diversification. He talked a lot about European markets. But again, I just found it all rather woolly on all sides, rather unsatisfying, and voters not maybe left with, I think, an appreciation of some very tough internal domestic conversations that we're going to have as we move towards a negotiation with Trump.
So couldn't agree with you more, right? It was a woolly discussion. All the trade-offs are buried. It's going to be, in a immediate sense, it's going to be tough. Let me get above it just for 1 second, Rudyard, and say something that might surprise you. I hope we're not first to the table.
This is an argument David Frum has made, incidentally, on our weekly show.
Right, exactly. I think David's absolutely right. Slow it down. There is a meeting scheduled for Friday where a Canadian team will start these negotiations. And you can see why people would want that, because they
uncertainty. They want to get rid of uncertainty.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
It's killing us.
That's right. There's an uncertainty premium that we're all paying. But I think after that, we slow down. We let India go first. We let Japan go next. You hope that the South Koreans line up. Let's see what kind of deals this administration is willing to make. And there's two kinds you could think of, frankly. Rudyard has said before, this guy is going to be happy with a fig leaf. We can make some small concessions, and he's going to walk away and claim victory. There's no there. He blinks. And there's a lot of evidence to support.
And he's desperate right now for a deal because he's not getting one from anybody else.
If Rudyard's correct, we wait. We wait. We slow walk this, and we wait. If, in fact, he's very tough and the others don't get deals, then I think we have a very different understanding. So Canadians have to have what I call strategic patience over these next several months. And
boy, those are two words I often associate with the Canadian electorate.
Strategic patience.
And hockey fans. Strategic patience.
That's more nice.
Let's enjoy the Stanley Cup run up here and leave the government time now.
We've been focused on all these big, immediate issues facing Canadian voters. One, though, that probably isn't on the mind of most people as they go to the polls tonight and today is that the next Prime Minister will chair the G7 in the month of June, which not only means that he will have a disproportionate influence over the G7 agenda, but it might be the only time we have President Trump in Canada.
Yeah.
So just talk a bit about the upcoming G7, its significance for the incoming government, and what, if anything, the incoming Prime Minister can do between tomorrow and early June to situate his government in a way that maximizes the G7 in Canada's interests.
So, Sean, as you well know, it is alarmingly close, the G7, after the election. And I'd be very surprised if this Prime Minister has had the bandwidth, given the length of the campaign, the transition to really focus on it.
And the same should be said for Pierre Poilievre, who has less executive experience in the world of foreign affairs, has fewer relationships amongst G7 leaders in other countries.
All of that.
And would coming into office ostensibly with a series of domestic priorities and then having to turn his mind to the fact he's hosting his G7 colleagues in Kananaskis.
Right. So there is a bureaucracy, a senior federal bureaucracy that has transition papers. And those transition papers cover 5, 6, 7 big G7 issues, and there are 4 subparagraphs in each one of them, and there are options under all of them. That's what they read like, but they are waiting.
Yes.
Prime ministerial leadership and direction. And there are no surprises, right? They're all things that you would expect to see on the G7. AI, governance of AI, safe AI, AI's opportunity, these kinds of issues. The bigger question here is, first of all, does Trump come?
Does Trump care about any of this stuff, though, Janice? He doesn't care about AI safety. He doesn't care about
he
emissions.
Does not.
He doesn't
care. Does he come, Rudyard? Does he actually come?
Good question.
Who knows? And if he does come, how disruptive is he at the table? Those are going to be the really big issues.
Yeah. Janice, do you got time for some questions from our online audience?
I sure do. Well, let me tell you one, just before we go to them. Let me tell you one I was asked today in some media interviews I was doing. Does the Canadian Prime Minister emerge as the leaders of the rebels against Trump?
Right.
I say no way.
That doesn't sound too comfortable.
No way. And this is, again, I think it's so important as Canadians that we remember we live next door to the United States.
Yes. Let somebody else do that.
Europeans have that challenge.
Yes.
It would be suicidal for a Canadian
May I just say, though, and this maybe is a synthesis of your expertise in my experience in politics, is I worry about something Roger talked about earlier, Janice, which is there will be a considerable segment of the Canadian population that would respond affirmatively to the notion that Canada ought to position itself as the leader of the rebels. And so whoever wins this election is going to, as Rudyard says, face some pretty excruciating choices in these negotiations. Issues that our audience will be familiar with, supply management, our CanCon rules,
language,
on internet regulation, and all the rest. But maybe
culture.
Maybe ones that we're not even talking about. Like, for instance, that the administration insists that we have a common tariff regime towards China and other parts of the world. Are we, in effect, prepared to hand over extraterritorially our trade policy to, of all people, Donald Trump? And so I worry a lot, Roger and Janice, that the next prime minister, in a way, may be sealing his own fate by securing a deal in the Canadian interest.
Well, that's why I say slow walk this, number one. And the second thing is, whoever that next prime minister is has to withstand the temptation to play politics with Canadian nationalism coming out of this election.
Well, there's all that tariff money to spend. There's a lot of politics to play. I just want to report on the latest numbers here. We've got Liberals majority elect in 19, leading in 3 for a total of 22 odd. The Conservatives coming out of Atlantic Canada, majority elect in 6, leading in 4 for a total of 10. So better numbers than literally the polls would have predicted over the last couple of weeks.
Isn't that better than the last election?
Yes.
When the Conservatives
marginally. This would,
8?
if these numbers hold in Atlantic Canada, this would resemble something closer to what the Conservatives had in 2011 when they won a majority government. So I think there's 3 things to say quick before we get to Janice's expertise in response to our question. First, as I say, the seat numbers are pushing up against higher end of Conservative expectations. 2, as important as the seat numbers are, Roger and Janice, it's the closing of the gap relative to what we saw in polling in Atlantic Canada, which is giving some Conservatives optimism that we may see them outperform polls in other parts of the country. If they're wrong in Atlantic Canada, does that mean they may be wrong?
Do you think that's right or wrong?
I'm afraid I don't know. But then the third thing I'd say is Conservatives will feel very good tonight that Sean Fraser, the former immigration minister, seems poised to lose his seat. Viewers will recall that he announced that he was stepping down from politics, and then after Mark Carney became leader and the party started to surge, he announced that he indeed would re-up his seat, and it looks like if these numbers hold, he might be at this point the highest profile Liberal incumbent to go down in defeat.
Yeah. Well, let's go to Elliot Gross for a couple questions to the live chat. And maybe, Elliot, as you tee up questions, maybe we can get that Polymarkets number up again at some point, just to take a look at where Polymarket is at, too. That's always fascinating to check out. So, Elliot, first to you for a question, though.
All right, well, we have many admirers of Janice in the chat. But JP is asking, you've spoken in the past about the breakdown of the WTO and the formation of dominant regional trade blocs, which for Canada meant reliance on the U.S. is key. How do you see this evolving?
Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, look, that's a great question. And that's what we are seeing, frankly. We've seen two things. One, we've seen global trade drop.
This is something you've said in various places that is counterintuitive for a lot of people. Why don't you just elaborate for a minute?
We had really the years from the mid-1980s right up until about 2010, 2014. Global trade grew every year as a proportion of the global economy.
Yes.
And that was the period of high globalization, open economies, and that was wonderful for Canada, frankly, because we are a trading nation and we're small and we do well when people play by the rules.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, that's gone.
And the result is?
And we see global trade is dropping.
Yes.
One of the interesting things to talk about, it's astonishing. The United States is dependent, the share of its GDP that is a result of trade is 13 to 16%, depending on how you count.
Wow.
Right? Just think about that for a moment.
That autarky.
Is so low.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is a self-sufficient, largely self-sufficient.
And my understanding is that our trade with the U.S. alone is responsible for something like 30% of our GDP.
Yeah, 20+%, just our trade with the United States alone.
Wow.
So you see the asymmetries between the two countries. If, in fact, and then there's all this trading within Europe. So people are talking about, we'll join the European Union. I don't think we want to do that, folks.
Yes.
This is a highly bureaucratized community, highly regulated community.
Yes.
It's
like Laurentian capitalism on steroids, European style.
If you don't make your brie cheese in exactly the right way, you cannot use the word brie as well. So that's a part of Europe that we often don't understand well enough. And the internal regulation will be so much heavier than we have now. This is not cost-free. Secondly, cost of shipping matters.
Yes.
And geography matters. So that's why I'm trying to put the brakes a little bit on these expectations that we are in the process of a divorce from the United States. We can't.
Polls have closed in Ontario. Let's go back and check out Polymarket just to see. I mean, it's not going to reflect the Ontario numbers yet, but
what do we see?
There we have it. It's kind of come off. Earlier this evening, we saw those two lines converging more. They've narrowed a bit, but they've come off. The tightness that we saw when those results first started to trickle in from Atlantic Canada. So still 73% chance, according to Polymarket, based on somewhere in the order of $64 million at play here. It's a cool way of looking at how people are waging actual money on the outcome of tonight's election.
Let me tell you, I was chairing a meeting today in the Monk School, and I started it off by saying, put $5 on the table, everybody. We have an office pool.
Yeah.
Because you have to have some skin in the game. Right?
Good.
And the predictions really converged around a strong Liberal minority.
Okay.
There were outliers at both ends, but
we're hearing that too.
Yeah.
Look, I think it could be the safe bet if, again, these lower information, I don't mean that pejoratively, but lower participation voters come out, which we will see, because Ontario will be key. Let's go back, Jensen, just get one more question from the chat, because I know Elia's had a whole bunch of people that have questions there for you, and we're going to go to those throughout the night. And just remind people on the chat, please share the link of this web stream via your emails, your socials, and of course, get out to friends and family and let them know to join if you want some smart, civil, substantive conversation about the election. Hub Election 2025 on election night is your go-to place. Elia, over to you.
Okay, Duat in the chat is asking about your experience at the university lately. Are you noticing a more conservative shift amongst the traditionally liberal university cohort?
Yeah, what's happened with the protest, Janice? You were a big part of trying to help U of T through that period. How have universities come through that moment? We haven't seen the return of the encampments.
No.
Is there a different, some lessons learned on the part of administrations, maybe students recalibrating in this environment? I mean, the war continues. The causes of those initial encampments remain. Has something changed on university colleges?
I think it has, Rudyard. I think university leaders are leading. They are saying two really important things. Universities are not political institutions. We are not going to take political positions on issues, no matter how grave, how important they may feel to anybody within the university. So that's a deliberately designed retreat across North America from universities as political actors. If you look at the last, really since 2020, that's a big pullback for universities, and it's not inconsequential. The second thing the university is doing, and certainly the University of Toronto is, a renewed emphasis on civility. We are here to argue, to debate, to think, to bring evidence to the table, but there are boundaries to that. It means you don't go after people personally, you don't insult people, you don't threaten people, you don't harass people. It's just not okay in the context of a university to behave that way. So I think if you look at the difference in the last year from the previous 5, you are seeing a really much more deliberate attempt to create a culture of civil debate and discussion, which is critical to the flourishing of any institution of learning. You can't learn if there are threatening behaviors in the classroom.
Well, Janice, thank you for finding time in a busy night to come
to
down to the Hub
the
Studios.
Two of you a question before
you
turn
the tables.
Go, because these are two experts. Based on what you're seeing, have you revised your predictions about the outcome of the election since you started this broadcast?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think that I won't speak for Sean, but I think that we've talking to our pollsters, talking to people that are door knocking, talking to MPs. It did seem that the Trump effect faded a little bit over the last 10 to 14 days. I think that gave the Conservative campaign some oxygen. Pierre Poilievre's debate performance was more than adequate. I think for me, it was the first time I saw him genuinely look prime ministerial. And I think that creates the possibility for the scenario that I've thought most likely, which is that Carney is held back from his goal of a majority government. Now, whether that is held back to the point where Pierre wins a minority, I think that is a bigger stretch. But I've always felt that, that there could be a path here for Conservatives to hold Mark Carney to something short of a full majority.
Yeah, I agree with that. The only thing I'd add, Janice, and I don't say this in a disparaging way or a conspiratorial way, I have to emphasize that. But the Conservative coalition is so unique, so uncharacteristic in this election campaign that I have had a suspicion or at least a wonder if the polling was accurately capturing what was happening, particularly with younger voters. There's also, of course, the well-known shy Tory syndrome, where people are self-conscious about,
especially younger ones.
Precisely, and so as the polls started to tighten, I think in a way it's a question about whether it tightened because the environment changed or because pollsters were fine-tuning their methodology and their weighting in order to reflect what was happening amongst younger voters, which is a long way of saying I agree with Rudyard that it'll probably be closer than it looked a couple of weeks ago. I'm just not sure if that reflects a fundamental change in this election, or if it's always been close and it's just taken a while for us to expose what's happening with these younger voters.
Let me just say this, that if it turns out to be much closer, there are pollsters all over this country tomorrow morning who are not going to be having a good day, frankly. And it has to do with how you poll in the age of new media.
Precisely.
Right? And that's a really interesting topic for the two of you to take
Exactly, in a way that is not, needs to say, neither disparaging nor conspiratorial. Right. I'm certainly not accusing them of malice. I think there is, though, maybe some open questions about how we do polling in light of some of the dynamics that you're talking about.
Yeah. Fascinating times.
Yes, indeed.
Just had the numbers up there on the screen, if we could go back to that. So we're seeing some of the Quebec numbers come in. Again, these are very early percentages on the total vote here, but the BQ is not, completely on the floor maybe early on here. We'll have to see where this goes. Conservatives are holding some of the, I'm just looking at the list of seats here. They've got some holds around Quebec City where the party has really been strong now for many elections. So again, maybe not a big Liberal sweep of the Belle Province. But again, we'll have to see. This is still early.
That looks like a lower Liberal number again, Rudyard, than the polls predicted, if this holds.
Yeah, it's noisy because it's still early. Yeah. But I will say that, and we're going to have Jenny Roth on next, who's one of our political experts here at the Hub. But that number, 39.8 of the popular vote so far for the Conservatives, would exceed Stephen Harper's performance in 2011 when he won a majority. And that number is bound to go up, particularly as we head west.
So that's a very good point, Sean. Yeah, because in some ways the popular vote's more interesting at this early stage.
Exactly.
I'm glad we're paying your salary. You're actually doing some work here. You're actually doing some work here. This guy can actually pull some stuff out of the hat.
And
I'm impressed.
Way out of my lane and right in your lane, but it is something I think that we should take away tomorrow and think about. If one party wins a majority of seats, but another one wins.
We've been talking about it,
vote, that is a question I think that we have to really think hard about how our democracy works.
This is something people don't always appreciate. In effect, for the past few elections, we've had the flip of the U.S. dynamic, in which the Conservatives won the popular vote in 1921. There's a decent chance, particularly with the support in the Prairie Province, it does again in this election, and yet still is shut out of government. Yeah. And as you say, that may pose some more structural questions for our politics.
Janice, thank you so much. Thank you for coming on the Hub. We always love your analysis, your comments, your insights, and a confession that, Janice was my teacher at the University of Toronto, along with Amal Atar-Guzman, our producer there at the back, and you've taught just thousands upon thousands of young people across this country, and I think you've just made such an amazing contribution as an educator, and I'd just like to acknowledge that in front of our audience.
Thank you, Rudyard. And it is the best job in the world.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah. Okay. Janice, thank you so much. That was great, Sean. We got some great guests coming on. Jenny Roth will be up in a moment, one of our favorite commentators on all things political. But
I'm just an amateur. She's the real pro. I can't wait to get her read on on what's happening so far.
It's early, and hopefully she'll stick around for a little bit. I also feel, Sean, like you and I may have earned a beer. It's 9:45. We've got a lot of cold ones out there. So maybe while you're asking questions for Jenny, I will sneak out and see to some of our guests in the green room, and maybe I'll even bring something back if you can pull out other interesting stats like the one you just had on popular vote. Because Sean, that's interesting. Coming out of Atlantic Canada, we don't know how much of Quebec has counted yet, but if we have, a Conservative popular vote at 40% out of those two provinces, that would suggest some real momentum possibly going into Ontario, and then boom, you add those large Western numbers. Maybe we have a popular vote in the low 40s by the time the evening's over.
Yeah, which has always been a challenge for the Conservative Party, dating back to its founding in 2003, 2004. There was a sense that it faced the ceiling, Roger, that was capped at 38 or so percent of the popular vote. And in that sense, the party has, of course, been dependent on vote splits with the New Democrats, particularly in English Canada, in order to have a path to victory. A world where it's pushing up well north of 40%. That's interesting and notable. And even if they lose, it may be crucial to the argument that Pierre Poilievre makes to party members and its parliamentary caucus that he deserves another chance.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
We got Ginny, finally. Ginny Roth, a partner at Crestview Strategies, former director of communications for Pierre Poilievre's leadership campaign, and of course, one of our favorite contributors to the Hub and someone who's been with us every step of the way with our daily shows throughout this campaign. Ginny, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Although, you guys didn't warn me. I left my glass of wine downstairs.
Ginny, why don't we just start big picture? What, if anything, can we take from what we've seen so far coming out of Atlantic Canada? Are you in a position to make any early judgments about what it might portend for tonight's overall results?
So I think I, like many conservatives, have spent the last number of days managing my own expectations.
Yes.
And trying to, have a really sober read of the polling, the seat modeling, et cetera. And so I was girding for a bit of a sweep on the part of the Liberals in Atlantic Canada, and that seems not to have panned out at all. In fact, it looks like we might see a net gain in seats for the Conservatives with a bit of success in Newfoundland and Labrador. So I am cautiously optimistic as a Conservative about that so far. There are some interesting things to note, like you all were just talking about the popular vote. The NDP is underperforming the popular vote quite egregiously. And, on the one hand, I was thinking, well, that's actually really impressive that the Conservatives are still winning seats despite that, bottom of the barrel, bottom of the bucket performance for the NDP, given that Conservatives traditionally rely on a split on the left. On the other hand, if that trend continues nationally, that could be a real problem for Conservative vote efficiency in other ridings. So I haven't decided yet what to take from the NDP performance in terms of extrapolating. But I will say you win government with seats, not votes. And so far, Conservatives are seeing a net gain in seats. And they're starting from a pretty strong floor.
Yes.
So I think the Liberals are probably a little bit worried,
yes.
Cautiously concerned, and Conservatives are a bit cautiously optimistic.
Ginny, before you came on, we were talking a bit about what to make of the Conservatives seemingly outperforming polls through Atlantic Canada. Do you want to comment on that? Is it something we should take note of? What if anything, might it tell us?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of ways that the polls could be, maybe put it slightly differently. There's a couple of ways that the prognostications could be wrong. One way is that the polling itself could be wrong. Not, as you said earlier, not because of some conspiratorial reason, but because in the area of new media, people not using their phones as frequently, not being online. It is harder to pull a representative sample than it used to be. And it's possible that the pollsters, in pulling their samples to survey throughout the RIP period, just haven't been able to adequately draw a representative sample, and maybe they're missing out on young men or whatever. There's some group that they're not able to access. Given the current results, it's still possible the polls are right. I mean, 39% would be on the upper end of where the Conservatives sat in the polls over the last few days, but it's within the range.
Yes.
The second way that the prognostications could be wrong is on seat modeling. So people like you and me and others are constantly looking at these different seat models online and trying to figure out, in our system, how does the popular vote play out in various seats? That is where you can really be led astray, because these are really thoughtful people. They've got really sophisticated models, but the models can't account for realigned voters, changing demographics, different turnout. They just overlay those data points from the previous election. And so if Conservative voters are getting younger, or they're more energized, or liberals voters are getting older and they're also more energized, like, all those factors are really, really hard to prognosticate. They don't account for incumbency advantage, really. They don't account for, there's a seat in Nova Scotia right now that Rick Perkins might lose because there was no NDP candidate by the deadline. Like, these are all anecdotal pieces of important information that you and I would apply in a sort of common sense way, but that those models can't really apply.
Yes.
So there are lots of ways that we can be surprised on election night. I don't think it doesn't speak to the pollsters being like totally off necessarily. It just means that elections are idiosyncratic.
Yes.
One of the interesting things that Daryl Bricker brought to the conversation the last few days is that the NDP vote may have collapsed in kind of Metro Toronto and parts of the GTA, and that may be skewing a bit the provincial numbers, that it may be a very concentrated loss.
Okay.
What are you going to start to look for, Ginny, in the next half hour or so as, for bellwether Ontario ridings? I'm personally, because I live downtown, I'm curious about St. Paul's. Is that a riding that Conservatives possibly could hold on the basis of a strong, Jewish vote who has stuck with the Conservative Party, and in fact, to some extent, was less than enthused. In fact, quite critical at times of Mark Carney's unwillingness to, to call out behavior within his own party related to the war in Gaza.
Yeah, I don't know about St. Paul's. I think probably the Conservatives can win government without winning St. Paul's. That was, if you think about that by-election, it was like the peak of displeasure with Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government. But yeah, I think your point is very well taken. And in ridings, I would look to Eglinton Lawrence, to York Centre, both Toronto proper ridings with strong Jewish constituencies, and also strong ally of Jewish constituencies. The waspy lady that lives beside her Jewish best friend might also be swayed by these dynamics. And those seats also, Karen Stintz in Eglinton Lawrence and Roman Baber in York Centre, those are really strong candidates. Yes. So those are ridings I would look to in Toronto proper. And then, of course, the GTA is really, really important. York Region could be an area of strength for the Conservatives. I think Peel might be tougher. And how those splits play out, which, those results are going to start to roll in the next number of minutes, I think will give us a better sense of where things might be going.
Ginny, I want to talk about a couple of different demographic groups and how they're playing out in this election campaign, and what they may mean for tonight's results and moving forward for Conservative politics. The first is younger voters. The Conservatives under Pierre Poilievre have essentially flipped the script and have had strong performance with younger voters, something, incidentally, that has drawn attention, Rudyard, from Conservative parties all over the Anglo-American world trying to figure out the Poilievre formula. And the second is realignment voters, what you might characterize as working class or blue collar voters who've increasingly shifted from the NDP to the Conservatives, and puts the Conservatives in a position to compete in places like Sudbury, where Poilievre was towards the end of the campaign, Thunder Bay, where I'm from, and parts of the Lower Mainland, and so on. What do you think has contributed to this change in the composition of Conservative support, including younger voters and realignment voters, and how might it influence tonight's outcome?
So first I would just comment on the ridings. When I look to Ontario, I also really want to look at London, Southwestern Ontario, Northern Ontario, as you say, because there might be ridings in play there for the Conservatives that wouldn't traditionally have been historically. And it's exactly because of that more working class realignment. I attribute it to a totally different way of approaching an issue set. And so policy, for starters, Poilievre spent a lot of time talking about the economy, but he always talked about it in the context of cost of living at the micro level. And I think that really opened up an opportunity with a lot of more working class blue collar voters for him over the last 3 years. We saw this even very early in his leadership campaign. And also stylistically, I think he realized something that right of center leaders around the world were starting to realize over the last 5 to 6, 7 years, which is that there are a lot of voters that are culturally centrist, let's say, like common sense on cultural issues,
Yes.
on things like crime, et cetera, and economically
and the excesses
concerned about their
and the
pocketbooks.
excesses of identity politics. Ginny, why don't you talk a bit about that? One gets the sense that a lot of these voters have, it's the old adage, the New Democratic Party, they haven't walked away from the New Democratic Party. The New Democratic Party has walked away from them, in the sense that it has come to emphasize a set of divisive socio-cultural issues and subordinate the types of class-based issues that drew a lot of those voters to the party in the first place.
That's right. I mean, look at an issue like drug reform. On the one hand, you have the NDP pushing for so-called safe supply, so-called safe injection sites, seemingly, inspired by like PhD theses written by Marxists at universities, totally out of touch with, you ask a guy in work boots who might have voted NDP in the past, who might be a member of a private sector union, who says like, what? Giving drug addicts more drugs? Won't that hurt them? Won't that make them dangerous to people in their communities? Maybe we should help those people. I think there's something called drug treatment, like just those very basic issue divides on some of those cultural issues where I don't think these working class voters we're talking about are like super right wing or super culturally conservative. I think they're just mainstream. They
like
just
the
have sort
common
of like
sense of my
basic common
grandfather in
sense.
Thunder Bay. Yes, exactly.
That's right.
Ginny, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're going to add another voice to the conversation. I'm in studio here with Roger Griffiths, my co-founder and the publisher of The Hub. Of course, we have Ginny Roth, a partner at Crestview Strategy, one of our go-to voices on policy and politics. And we're joined in studio now with a fourth guest. The first time we've broken the blood-brain barrier here by adding a fourth person. Our team is
Sean. This beer is breaking the blood-brain barrier. Okay?
JJ McCullough has joined us all the way from British Columbia. JJ is, as our viewers will know, is a leading YouTube commentator here in Canada. One of the biggest YouTube subscriptions of all,
million
cultural
subscribers.
and policy.
I mean, the poor little hub has got to
Exactly.
struggle to keep up with
But he's
JJ.
someone who's written for the Washington Post and commented on policy and politics for a long time, and we're so lucky to have you here in Toronto, JJ.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here.
Why don't we start with British Columbia for a minute? The Conservatives, not so long ago had big ambitions about making gains in the province. I think those have diminished a bit. What are you expecting out of your home province?
Well, there's like a couple of ridings that I'm looking at pretty closely. And actually, one of them I was sort of brought to mind just with your conversation with Ginny, sort of talking about sort of like the decline of the NDP's connection with the sort of, white working class kind of stereotypical base.
Something that John Horgan, incidentally, the former BC NDP premier, had done a good job of maintaining that connective tissue.
Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time living in New Westminster, right?
Yes.
And New Westminster, for those who don't know, is kind of a sort of suburban area on the edges of Vancouver, and historically has been a very sort of like white working class bastion of NDP support. Like their mayors have often been NDP, votes NDP provincially, and has a long-standing NDP MP, Peter Julian.
Yes.
And they say that he is now for the first time, and he's had that seat for quite a while, and they say for the first time he's facing a bit of a tough battle. And I've been just sort of curious to know if there is a seat in British Columbia that I feel feels like a sort of stereotypical place that could go NDP Conservative, it would be Peter Julian's seat.
Wow.
And it didn't go that way with Erin O'Toole's similar kind of pitch that he got credit for sort of reaching out to these sorts of places. And I think actually the NDP vote went up under Erin O'Toole. So I'm watching that one pretty closely. I'm watching the whole affair with Mike DeYoung in Abbotsford.
Yes. Our reporter was there this week, and in fact, we had an exclusive interview with Mike DeYoung about his circumstances.
So that whole sort of scandalous affair, I think a lot of British Columbians are very curious about. Just to refresh, he was the former provincial Liberal cabinet minister, sort of a kind of great, I would say, statesman of BC provincial politics, and to sort of be denied a chance to
something of a prospective star candidate for the Conservatives, who they ultimately blocked and are instead running a 25-year-old. He in light of this offense, decided to run as an independent, and may, as a result, steal what would have otherwise been a pretty safe seat for the Conservatives.
Yeah, and it's interesting to imagine how he would be in Ottawa, particularly if we're talking about a very sort of tight minority government type of situation.
Yes.
Because even though, his instincts were to run for the Conservatives, we know that the BC Liberals under Premier Campbell was a kind of coalition government, right?
Interesting. I'm sorry to interrupt, but in the exclusive interview we had, I was struck by the extent to which Jean focused his ire at the kind of system or the party, if I can put it that way, and instead essentially pledged personal support for Pierre Poilievre. So, I don't get too far ahead, but if we end up in a minority context, Michael Jean might be the most important parliamentarian in Ottawa. Let me go to you and Ginny with a question for both of you. Pierre Poilievre has been in the public eye for a long time, but as we were talking about earlier, he's something of an enigmatic figure. There's a sense that he doesn't fully let people in, that he doesn't make himself vulnerable. You both know him a little bit. Ginny was his director of communications during the leadership. You were amongst the first people to interview him after he won the party leadership. What do you think? I'll go to Ginny first and then maybe come to you. Ginny, what do you think that people don't know about Pierre Poilievre that they ought to?
There was some commentary after his performance in the English language debate where he kind of, at the end, I think it was in response to what people what they regretted about the campaign period, and he said that he regretted not being able to talk to more people as he had in his leadership campaign, where he'd do these long lineups and meet everyone individually. And people commented that it seemed as though he was close to tears, and I said clearly that's true. He was almost close to tears, and I think that surprised everyone because they see him as this very cold, exacting person, and he's very single-minded, I would say. But that I think masks what a emotional person he is about the people in his life that he's intense about, and also about the people he's met over the last 3 years. He is incredibly moved by the people. And I think he's at his best when he is the most in touch with. My thought in response to that was, gosh, I wish he were doing some of these lines, because the focus grouping of that process might have been helpful over the course of the general election campaign in the way that I think it was in the leadership campaign. He is very obsessed with the daily concerns of everyday people, particularly when they're especially tough. And highly motivated by that. And I think it explains a lot about his behavior when people say he's angry, that. I think that's a lot of what's behind that.
JJ?
Yeah, I was struck by that as well. I've not only interviewed him, but I've sort of had some one-on-one time with him in different contexts. And I've also been sort of struck by a sense of empathy that seems very sincere. I've interacted with him a lot in the context of my opposition to Bill C-11, sort of the internet regulatory bill of the Trudeau government. And that, every time I spoke to him about it, and he would always recognize me as the Bill C-11 guy, and he would always ask me is this actually hurting creators like myself? And he would ask me about my friends and sort of people in this new economy, which I think he sincerely saw as a sort of new and exciting, promising sort of dimension of the Canadian sort of cultural entertainment economy that was sort of being snuffed out. So I always kind of had this sense that, he does believe this stuff quite deeply. He is a very sort of sincere politician. He is, not to use a sort of pejorative term, but he is a true believer in the sense that he's somebody that's been, sort of permeating in this kind of stuff for a long time.
Well, let me go to both of you again. Just on that point, one thing I think that's gone underreported in Canadian politics, not just in this election, but for some time, is generational change within elected Conservative politics itself. That is to say, the front bench of the Conservative opposition shadow cabinet is much younger than the Trudeau and then Carney cabinet that they opposed. Poilievre himself seems to me to be something of a generational figure in the sense that I think he's not that much younger than Erin O'Toole, but he conveyed an attentiveness to youthful issues in a way that distinguished him. Talk a bit. Maybe I'll start with you, JJ, and then go to Ginny about this change that's happening in Conservative politics and the kind of two-way conversation that younger Conservative elected officials are having with younger Canadians themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the big stories of this election. It's actually interesting. I was looking at some data from.
I'm like old now.
Yeah, I feel that way too.
I don't know what happened. I used to be young, and now I'm old.
Yeah, no, it is quite remarkable. Like when you talk to young people, particularly like when you talk to young people who aren't necessarily like super plugged into the political world, it has been interesting to observe the degree to which like supporting the Conservatives, or at least like being open about being conservative curious, is not a stigmatized position the way it previously was. And a lot of that I do think comes to the sort of the nature of Pierre's personality and the degree to which people find him, younger men especially, find him just to be sort of compelling and just like somebody that there is not the sort of stigma to support the way that I think traditionally conservative politics often has been stigmatized among youth.
Yes.
But what I was going to say is that I was looking at some of the polling data from Angus Reid, sort of surveying the political opinions of young people.
Yes.
And it is striking to observe just the degree to which the NDP, which historically I think had been, the party that you support when you're young and it's kind of cool and it's kind of edgy and it's kind of subversive, like that reputation I think has just completely plummeted.
Yes.
And I think that in addition, not just to completely be praising Pierre, but I think that Carney has also sort of sucked out some of that energy from the NDP. And one thing that's been quite striking to me to observe as well is the degree to which, like, it is not uncool to support the Liberals in the way that I think it traditionally was if you're a young person on the left. Carney has a certain kind of star power that has made the Liberal Party acceptable in the same way that Pierre's star power has made the Conservative Party acceptable.
And that's reflected in polls where the Liberals are essentially
so guys,
absorbing like 25
Sean,
to 50% of the
Sean just passed me his phone over here. Sean, do you look at this thing? You need a screensaver. This looks like a drug dealer's phone. Like it is. What the heck is this? I'll buy you a new phone, buddy. Okay, you're co-founder here. We'll get you a new phone. But you passed it over. This is incredible, guys. Student Vote Canada, which is a great charity that basically has high school students run a mock election. An old friend, Taylor Gunn, runs it. 900,000 students voted in the lead up to today's vote. And in fact, they cast their ballots today. 5,900 schools participated. They awarded the Conservatives 165 seats, giving them a win over the Liberals at 45 seats. These are high school students that are voting Conservative, Ginny. Like this kind of blows my mind in a way to see that. I mean, that just would not have happened.
When I was in high school, are you kidding me? It was like countercultural. I was like rebelling when I became a conservative against my peers.
It's
that's kind of mind-blowing to me.
And maybe it suggests a groundswell of youth support.
And Ginny, do you want to talk about some of the generational changes? I think of Jamal Javini, Rachel Danko, Mike Barrett, Aaron Gunn, really are. As I say, it's been, I don't know if you guys know this. Do you know there are only 2 MPs that were elected under legacy party banners, Cheryl Gallant and Scott Reed? More than 50% of Conservative MPs were actually elected after 2015. The party's just gone through this transformation, trending in a younger direction, and yet no one is talking about it. And you wonder if we're seeing the kind of fruits of that manifest themselves in some of these numbers.
Yeah, someone I know was criticizing Polyev to me that he's like only recruited people who will sing from his psalm book. I'm like, actually, a ton of the people he's recruited are really independent-minded people, many of whom, like Jamal Javani and Aaron Gunn, who have audiences of their own and who've made a name for themselves by having a perspective and their own views on issues. But I think the point this person was making is they all seem to have a similar stylistic tendency. And I think that there's something to this. Like when you ask older people what they don't like about Polyev, and there's a lot of people who don't like older people who don't like Polyev, there's something vibey about it. They don't like that he seems kind of distrustful of institutions, that he doesn't have this respect for the establishment. And I think that is really like where the age split is. And it's not perfect. Like, as you say, in many ways, Aaron O'Toole, who wasn't that much older, had the vibes of an older voter. And I think that it's hard to express, but there's something about the way he talks that comes off as authentic and real and that people connect with. And that just does so much better with younger voters in a way that, Justin Trudeau like a long time after 2015 in recent years really didn't. He sounded like he was talking in theory in a way that was really removed from people. And when you hear people talk about that style in a way that is more reverent, it's like, I appreciate their oratory, or they sound prime ministerial. What they're essentially saying is, and I think this is what some older people like about Carney, he sounds like he's the establishment. He sounds like he's speaking with authority, like he's smarter than I am, and I want a prime minister who's smarter than I am. Poilievre doesn't sound like that. He sounds like me. And I think that is what a part of what's behind some of this weird demographic shift, which seems to be really significant.
In that vein, I'm just going to ask Elia Grosso on our team to pull up the poly market data. It's something we've been following throughout the night. Let's see what it's telling us about how those who are participating are feeling about the race at this point. So this is really striking. You'll recall, if you've been with us for some time, that approximately an hour ago or so, these numbers were converging something like 55-45. The last numbers I saw there showed them approaching 98% likely here, 97, 98% for the Liberals. So,
and Sean, what's happened is CTV has gone early and declared that there will be a Liberal government. They are not declaring whether that is a majority or a minority. But what we're seeing right now in Polymarket is an early declaration by CTV based on their seat projection model that Mark Carney will be the next Prime Minister of Canada tomorrow. What a great time with this panel around the table to reflect on this. Again, there can be a slip between cup and lip between now and the vote tally in Ontario and Quebec, but one has to assume that there is, something in the math here and the projection model that CTV is using that is causing them to declare a Carney victory, majority versus minority TBD. Maybe it in fact is the percentage vote, which has remained high for the Liberals as the tally in Ontario and Quebec has continued. So maybe, Ginny, some quick reaction from you to this developing news.
Yeah, I wondered, to your point about the popular vote, Rudyard, if the NDP with Ontario results coming in is not climbing up above whatever it was at 5%, 4.5%. I mean, that is just, the math just doesn't work.
Catastrophic.
For the Conservatives, or rather, it does work for the Liberals in that situation. That just helps them rack up enough seats that I think that broadcasters are comfortable. And it seems like it's multiple broadcasters calling it now.
Yeah,
so
CBC is doing the same. Although it's a bit unclear. We might want to pull up the feed, in fact.
Yeah, let's pull up the team here. Let's go on to the CBC feed. We can listen in for a little bit and chirp in the wings as the CBC anchor desk gives us their projection. Just one second. We'll take a moment to get that up.
We'll see if they can resist the temptation not to gloat.
JJ, just as we're getting that up, your thoughts on this? I mean, I just think of all those people at those rallies that were just so convinced that Pierre Poilievre was going to win. They, look, to their credit, they had a great passion for him, for the party. I just wonder how those people are going to react to a Carney majority in any shape, form, or size.
Yeah, and I mean, because I was seeing a lot of these posts and these memes, and people are using the blue wave emoji and all of this kind of stuff, and we have a good feeling and don't trust the polls. And you do wonder, to what degree was that sincerely believed, or is this just people trying to, kind of work through their own fears and pessimism and that kind of stuff? Because it's true. It's like you in any case, in any sort of election outcome, you want the outcome to be accepted and recognized as democratically legitimate. And I do hope that, that to the extent that people believe that we were on track for a Conservative victory, that they, perhaps only believe that hesitantly or, in sort of a somewhat, like I said, just to kind of hype themselves up, because it would be obviously terrible for this country if we have anything resembling a stop the steal election denial and this kind of thing. But, and that is in turn a sort of reflection of to what degree are people living in alternate sort of media realities, and to what extent did people truly believe that the Conservatives had a genuine chance of winning. Because if we're being objective about this, I feel like the polls were pretty clear. Like, you see these headlines where it's like, polls tightening, race tightening. And, that to some extent, that's clickbait, because then when you click through it and you see it and the Liberals still have a lead, right? Maybe the lead has gone from, 10 points to 7 points or 4 points to 3 points, but it's still a lead. And so I do hope that as much as people want to be team players and want to be good partisans and all the rest of it, that people were grounded firmly in reality and are able to accept that this was, the abundance of data suggested that this was the most likely outcome.
Yes. Sean, what are you seeing out there?
I don't know. I'm keen to understand more about what's behind the declaration of a Liberal win, Ginny. It's clear that, as you say, the NDP collapse is causing these networks giving them enough confidence rather to make that judgment. I guess the question for you is, as we move further out west, do you think the arithmetic can work for the Liberals to ultimately cement a majority government as opposed to a minority one? And it strikes me as a terribly important question on so many fronts. It possibly has implication for Pierre Poilievre's future as a leader of the Conservative Party, on the extent to which a new parliament is functional, about the future of the NDP. I mean, the list goes on and on. So maybe I'll just turn it to you, Ginny, to reflect on what we're hearing and where you think we may go next.
Yeah, the thing about the seat models and people like JJ from provinces that tend to have two-party systems, although BC's been touch and go on that, but for provinces that tend to have two-party systems, they'll know a majority is the more common outcome than not, because of the arithmetic with two parties. So I wouldn't be surprised if we end up in majority territory. We always knew that you could end up in a situation where the Liberals have a majority of seats, even if the Conservatives perform very well by historical standards. So, that seemed like the likeliest outcome, and it may well be the outcome.
Yes.
It does matter for the dynamics following the election, certainly. But I also don't know that it would matter all that much. I mean, I think if Carney won a solid minority, he would very easily be propped up by either the Bloc or the NDP.
Yes.
Probably more likely the Bloc, with the NDP maybe winning no seats at this point, or only a couple. And I think he would be able to drive an agenda. The Liberal model for the last number of years in Canada has been majority or minority, govern as though we have a majority, because if we don't win the seats ourselves, we can rely on other left of center parties to win them for us and support us as we try to govern. So I mean, that's a harsh thing for Conservatives to hear, I think. I think it's true.
Yeah. One theme that has been common in our conversations over the past several days is what it means, Ginny and JJ, if we're heading in the direction of what amounts to two-party races in English Canada. That, I think back to the 2011 election, of which I was a part, where the Conservatives win a pretty sizable majority by virtue of winning about 39% of the popular vote because of three-party splits. Ginny, it seems to me that one of the arguments that Conservatives are going to have after this election is what types of changes the party needs to make to its message and messenger and ideas and policies and strategies and tactics and all the rest to try to push its support up high enough that it doesn't have to depend on others like the NDP for its path to victory. What do you envision that conversation looking like, and how should we think about what comes next for the Conservative Party?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a tough conversation for Conservatives, because everyone's tempted. Well, not everyone. There are a lot of armchair quarterbacks who are tempted to just go to the quick, easy critique. But in any election, the counterfactual is rarely considered, right? I mean, I was making this point earlier today in another interview. We've gone from a five-party system to basically a two-party system in like 12 weeks.
Yes.
And it's not just the NDP and the Bloc that have kind of collapsed. It's also the PPC, like the party, the party to the right of the Conservatives in the PPC. I think we also are likely to find out that a lot of like right of center historic non-voters, or just people who tend to not vote, or Conservatives who didn't show up under Aaron O'Toole were all brought to bear by Polyev, that he like exploited the right side of the coalition to great effect. And so if people want to say, well, conservatives now need to rush to the middle and really severely moderate themselves in the context of a two-party race, like, sure, people are welcome to mount that argument, but they also have to account for the fact that that might mean that we blend Billy on the right, or that the conservatives would face a fracture on the right, potentially. So I think that's really a really tough conversation to have. I think Polyev is well positioned to be the leader, to sort of continue to be the leader through that conversation, for a bunch of reasons that we can maybe get into. But it's going to be a tough conversation. I do think it will be informed by this idea of having a two-party system, which really hasn't been a driver of the conversation in recent history.
JJ, how would you respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I don't know, I'm having sort of flashbacks to when George W. Bush was reelected in 2008. And I remember a sort of like dejected Democrat saying, at the end of the day, this is a center-right country. Yes. And I'm sort of feeling the same way, except the opposite in terms of Canada, is that this is just, in some ways, it might just be a center-left country.
Just sorry if I interrupt for a minute. One way I've thought about the race over the past few weeks is that Pierre Poilievre consolidated the right. Yeah. Mark Carney consolidated the left. The problem for conservatives is just more of them than there is of the conservatives.
Yeah, and so it's fundamentally like the arithmetic is just difficult. If you're operating in a two-party system where just the majority of the country is not really on your side, right? And this is sort of something that I've been thinking about a lot, because you can talk about the campaign that Pierre ran. You can talk about, like, did he go on enough shows? Did he do enough interviews and all of that? But it's like fundamentally, like, Pierre, as we were talking about earlier, is a very sincere guy. Like, he believes these things. He believes these principles that he thinks are right for the country. He can articulate them. He can put them forward. But at the end of the day, like, sometimes, as the old saying goes, sometimes the dogs just don't like the food, right? Yes. Like, you can do any sort of marketing you can to try to sell a certain product, but if ultimately the product that he's selling is not one that resonates with people, people can go into this, like, deeply informed, clear-eyed. They can know what he's offering. They can know what conservative politics are, but they can just say thanks, but no thanks. And I think that is sort of the challenge, because I think that too often you can kind of get trapped into this cycle where it's like, well, is there a way that we can kind of massage it? Can we trick people? Can we pitch basically conservative politics to a center-right or to a center-left electorate using just kind of like clever techniques and tricks and stuff? And it just... that might not be good enough, right?
Ginny, the Conservative Party now has tried to pick this lock a bunch of times, and they've tried a bunch of different combinations, from Aaron O'Toole to Andrew Scheer to now Pierre Poilievre, each, a different combination, a different permutation, and it's not working. I don't know. Just to build on the sentiment here, you always want to think that there's room for a higher ceiling, but I mean, this is a pretty high ceiling. This is a 40% ceiling. Like, what the heck do you do when you're not forming government and, he's outpolling, Stephen Harper's majority? I don't know. Yeah. I don't have answers for this. I don't expect you necessarily to have answers for that, but just to reflect on what that means. Sure. When you have strong numbers tonight for the Conservatives and an inability to form government.
Well, let's talk a bit about the context as well. Like, I think JJ's points are very well taken about Poilievre bringing his principles and policies to bear and the electorate not liking them enough. But the other thing that impacts elections is not how each leader and party behaves, but the circumstances that they're responding to. And, there's a couple things. One, the Trump circumstance is very strange. And to have one highly dominant issue overtake all other issues, even though in many cases, those other issues are really important to people, is strange and probably won't happen again in a national election in Canada. Or at least not anything exactly like it. So, that's one sort of consideration that I wouldn't want to overcorrect for or sort of assume is going to happen or bake into the next election. The other thing is like the broader, Rudyard, you and I actually talked about this in one of our daily conversations at the election. The cost of living situation has been poor for a lot of people, but I don't know, and you see this in the polling, I don't know that had yet converted into a really strong feeling about a desire for economic growth in the country, the types of policies that would drive economic growth in the country, and a willingness to put those issues before other issues. And I sadly think that might mean that that country has to be in a worse state. There have to be more people suffering. There have to be more people struggling in the context of their situation in order for the solutions that I think